The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Mara had always considered the most dishonest day of the week. Mondays warned you, Fridays paid you, but Tuesdays had a way of walking in quietly, sitting down at your table, and changing everything before you noticed they had even knocked. She was standing at the window of her small apartment in the lower district of Ashford when the royal courier knocked 3 times on her door, not the soft, uncertain knock of a man delivering groceries, but the hard, deliberate knock of someone carrying authority in his knuckles. She knew the difference. She had learned it young. She did not go to the door immediately. She set down her tea, which was still hot, and she looked at it for a moment the way you look at something you suspect you will not get to finish. Then she walked to the door, unlatched it, and found a man in silver and gray standing on her step with an envelope in his hands and absolutely no expression on his face. "Mara Ellis," he said. "You already know who I am," she said, "or you knocked on the wrong door and were both about to be embarrassed." He did not smile. He held out the envelope. It was heavy, real paper, the thick kind that cost more per sheet than her weekly groceries. The seal on the back was pressed in dark red wax, and the emblem pressed into it was one she recognized without wanting to: the crowned wolf of the Aldrich royal house, its head raised, its lines clean and unmistakable. She took it. The courier left without another word. She did not open it in the hallway. She closed the door, walked to the kitchen table, sat down and looked at the envelope for a full 4 minutes. She counted. She had a habit of counting when her hands wanted to shake, because counting required enough of her brain that the shaking had to wait. The envelope had her name on it in handwriting she did not expect to recognize and then did. She had seen that handwriting before. 5 years ago at the Ashford Council Summit, during the worst and most important 20 minutes of her life, she had stood at the back of a room full of important people and said the kind of things that get a person remembered for the wrong reasons. Afterward, a note had been passed to her through the crowd, a single line in that same dark, even script, informing her that she would be escorted from the premises. She had kept the note. She did not know why. It was in a shoebox under her bed alongside 3 other things she could not explain keeping. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was short. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected pages of formal charges, legal language, the kind of document that takes 3 readings to understand and leaves you feeling like you have failed an exam. Instead, there were 4 lines. "Miss Ellis, your presence is requested at the Aldrich compound beginning this Friday at noon. Accommodations will be provided. Please bring whatever you need for an indefinite stay. K. Aldrich." She read it twice, then a third time. No charges listed, no language about accountability or debts owed or consequences to be discussed. No formal title on the signature, which struck her as odd, because in her experience, men with power used their titles the way other people used locks, constantly, and to keep things out. "Indefinite stay." She set the letter down. She had spent 5 years building a very precise understanding of what King Callum Aldrich thought of her, and that understanding had 2 parts. The first part was that he remembered her. The second part was that whatever he intended to do about that memory was going to be unpleasant. This understanding had become so familiar that she had stopped questioning it. It was simply the background noise of her life, the low hum that played under everything else, the awareness that someday the knock would come and it would be his. And now the knock had come. And the letter said nothing about punishment. It said nothing about the summit. It said nothing about the things she had said in that room 5 years ago, in front of 300 council members and 2 foreign dignitaries and the king himself, who had been sitting at the head table with the perfectly still expression of a man deciding something. She had called his policy a structure built on paper by men who eat well enough to think that eating well is simple. She had said it clearly, loudly, and without apology, because she had come from a village where people were not eating well, and where the policy he had just ratified was about to make that worse. She had not gone to that summit planning to say it. She had gone to deliver a petition from her village council, and she had stood in the back of that room and listened to delegate after delegate speak about the policy in theoretical terms: productivity benchmarks, regional output projections, the sustainable management of agricultural surplus, and something inside her had simply stopped being patient. She had raised her hand. She had not been acknowledged. She had raised her voice instead. 300 heads had turned. and King Callum Aldrich, who had been writing something, had looked up. She remembered his eyes. She had not wanted to remember them, but she did. Light gray, the kind of gray that in certain light looks almost blue, and in other light looks like the sky before it decides to rain. He had looked at her, and his pen had stopped moving, and the room had gone very quiet. She had said what she came to say. She had been escorted out. She had expected an arrest within the week, then within the month, then within the year. 5 years had passed and no arrest had come, and she had slowly, carefully rebuilt a life in Ashford, a job at a district records office, a small apartment, a routine that was simple but entirely her own. She had learned to stop flinching every time she heard official boots on cobblestones. And now the letter. She picked it up again and read the 4th line. Please bring whatever you need for an indefinite stay. She thought about what that meant. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, not quickly but thoroughly, turning it over and looking at the underside. In her experience, when powerful people said, bring whatever you need, they were either being genuinely accommodating or they were telling you that what you needed was not going to matter, so you might as well have it. She could not yet tell which this was. She went to her bedroom and looked at the shoebox under her bed for a long moment. She did not take it out. She stood there, hands at her sides, jaw set in the particular way her mother had called your deciding face, and she made a list in her head. The list had 2 columns. The first column was reasons not to go. It was a long column. It included the fact that the king of the Aldrich territory had every legal and political reason to be unhappy with her. That indefinite stay was a phrase that could mean many things, and several of them were bad, and that going voluntarily to the home of someone who had cause to punish you was the kind of thing only very brave or very foolish people did, and she was not entirely sure which she was. The second column was reasons to go. It had 1 entry. The letter did not say she had a choice. She started packing on Wednesday morning. She was not, she told herself, afraid. Fear was a thing she had considerable experience with. It had been a near constant companion through her childhood in the village of Creslow, where money was short and winters were long, and her mother had worked herself into an early tiredness that she never recovered from. She knew fear's texture, its smell, the particular way it settled in the stomach like a cold stone. What she felt now was not exactly that. It was something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something, not the fear of falling, but the awareness that falling was possible, and that the ground below was not visible from where she stood. She packed practically 2 changes of clothes, her good coat, her notebook, the small pouch of dried herbs she carried everywhere for tea because she did not trust other people's tea, and the book she was currently reading, which was about the migratory patterns of birds and had absolutely nothing to do with anything but was comforting in the way that things about birds sometimes are. She did not pack the shoebox. She also did not tell anyone where she was going, because the people in her life who would worry about it were also the people who would say don't go, and she had already decided, and she did not want to argue with people she cared about when she was carrying a cold stone in her stomach. Friday morning came gray and damp. She ate breakfast standing at her kitchen counter, bread with butter, an apple, the last of a pot of good coffee she had been saving, and she looked around her apartment with the specific attention of someone cataloging what they are leaving behind. It was not much. The apartment was small, and she had never been a collector. There were plants on the windowsill that her neighbor, old Mr. Pace across the hall, had agreed to water. There were books stacked on every flat surface because she had run out of shelf space 2 years ago and refused to stop buying books. There was a drawing pinned to the kitchen wall that a child from the records office had made for her last winter, a lopsided orange sun above 2 stick figures, one short and one tall, labeled in crooked letters, Mara and me. She looked at the drawing for a moment. She left it where it was. The royal transport arrived at precisely noon, a dark, understated carriage with no royal markings on the outside, which she found interesting. Either the king did not want people knowing she was coming, or he did not want people knowing he was the one bringing her. Both possibilities said something, and she filed them away to think about later. The driver was a woman, which Mara had not expected, with short silver hair and the compact efficiency of someone who had been doing difficult things for a very long time. She introduced herself as Nora, your driver, and did not offer conversation, which Mara appreciated more than she could easily explain. The journey took 4 hours. Mara spent the first hour watching the city give way to the outer districts, the buildings getting lower and farther apart, the streets getting quieter, the sky getting larger. She spent the second hour reading her bird book. She spent the third hour thinking about the letter and trying not to think about the letter, which is the same thing, only more exhausting. She spent the fourth hour with her head tipped slightly back against the seat, not quite sleeping but not quite awake, in the suspended state that long journeys produce in people who are carrying something heavy. She was not afraid. She was cataloging exits. The Aldrich compound appeared through the trees in the late afternoon light, not dramatically, not the way compounds appeared in stories, all towers and gates and the suggestion of doom. It came into view the way a very large, very old house comes into view, gradually through the trees, first a roofline, then windows, then the full scale of it, which was considerable but not theatrical. Stone walls, dark and weathered, tall windows, a courtyard with an iron gate that stood open. The gate was standing open. She noticed that. Nora pulled the carriage through the gate and into the courtyard, where two people were waiting, a man with a clipboard who introduced himself as the compound steward, and immediately began telling her about meal times and common areas in the tone of someone who has given this speech many times and finds it perfectly adequate, and a young woman named Claire who picked up Mara's bag before Mara could stop her, and smiled with the unpretentious warmth of someone who was simply glad to have something to carry. There was no sign of the king. Mara was led through a side entrance into the interior of the compound, and she noted automatically the layout of the hallway, the positions of the doors, the directions they turned. She had been doing this her entire adult life, building a map in her head of wherever she was, so that if she needed to leave quickly, she would know how. Old habit, older than she liked to admit. Her room was on the second floor of the domestic wing, and it was she stopped in the doorway and looked at it for a moment, a real room. Not a cell with better curtains, a room with a window that looked out over a garden, a bed with enough blankets that she could choose the weight she wanted, a small desk with a lamp, bookshelves that were empty and waiting, and on the nightstand a small pot of tea that was still steaming. Someone had timed that. She stood in the doorway and looked at the tea. She thought about what kind of person arranges for a warm pot of tea to be on the nightstand at the exact moment a guest arrives. She thought about what that person wants from the guest, and what the tea is designed to make the guest feel, and whether she was reading too much into a pot of tea, which was possible, or whether she was right to read into it, which was also possible. The steward cleared his throat gently behind her. She stepped inside. The door closed softly. She was alone. She set her bag on the chair, walked to the window and looked out at the garden below, tidy paths, low hedges, the last of some late-season flowers she didn't know the names of. The garden was empty. The light was going gold and thin, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything look like a painting of itself. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned and looked at the room again, the bookshelves, the lamp, the desk, the bed, the carefully chosen number of pillows, and the tea, still steaming on the nightstand. She had prepared herself for many things. She had prepared for cold rooms and locked doors, and the formal language of official displeasure. She had prepared for the particular discomfort of being made to wait in places designed to remind you that you are waiting. She had prepared herself for all the variations of you will answer for what you did. She had not prepared for this. The tea, the empty bookshelves, the window with the garden. She sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the pot, poured herself a cup and held it in both hands. It was good tea, not the watery, generic kind, but something with depth, slightly floral, the kind of tea that someone who actually thought about tea had chosen. She drank it slowly. She was still cataloging exits. But her hands, she noticed, had stopped wanting to shake. She woke the next morning to the sound of something large and orange sitting on her feet. It took her a moment to process this, because she had been in a deep, dreamless sleep of the kind that only happens when the body has decided to trust a place before the mind has given permission, and she had not given permission. Her mind was still very much in the business of not trusting anything. But her body, apparently, had made its own arrangements overnight. The large orange thing on her feet resolved itself as she became more awake into a cat, a substantial cat, a cat with the build of something that had never missed a meal and the expression of something that did not care what you thought about that. It was sitting squarely on her ankles, watching her with pale green eyes, and when she moved it pressed its considerable weight down slightly, as if to register a mild objection. "You are not supposed to be in here," she told it. It blinked. She sat up, it resettled to her knees, apparently undisturbed by the change in terrain. She looked at it, it looked at her. She was not generally a cat person. She had never owned a pet, had never had room for one, had spent most of her adult life in the kind of circumstances where taking care of another living thing felt like one more thing that could go wrong. But she was also, if she was being honest, not entirely unhappy to have something warm and alive on her knees in an unfamiliar room on a strange morning. She looked at the window. The garden was gray and still in the early light. The tea things from the night before were where she had left them, cup, pot, spoon, and on the desk was her notebook, which she had placed there herself before sleep, because she always slept with her notebook in arm's reach. Old habit. She used it for thinking out loud, which was the only kind of thinking out loud she allowed herself. She reached over and stroked the cat once between the ears with 2 fingers. It closed its eyes. "Brutus," said a voice from the hallway. She went still. Then a knock 3 times, unhurried. "He's in here, isn't he?" said the voice. It was not a question. It was the voice of someone who already knew the answer and was being polite about it. Low voice. Even. The kind of voice that did not raise itself to reach you, it expected you to be close enough to hear. She knew it immediately. She had spent 5 years making sure she would. She got out of bed, the cat jumped down with the kind of dignity that suggested it had always intended to, and she pulled on her good coat over her sleep clothes because it was the first thing in reach and she was not going to open a door to the king of the territory in her nightwear. She didn't care how early it was. She ran one hand through her hair. She set her jaw in the deciding way. She opened the door. King Callum Aldrich was standing in the hallway. He was not wearing a crown. This struck her as such an obvious observation that she felt slightly ridiculous for noticing it, but she noticed it. He was wearing dark trousers and a grey pullover with a small hole near the left collar, the kind of hole that comes from a catch on something, a drawer handle, a door frame, and had been ignored rather than repaired. He was holding a mug of something hot in one hand. His hair was not arranged. His eyes, in the plain morning light of the hallway, were exactly the grey she had remembered. She had rehearsed this moment approximately 200 times in the last 5 years. She had rehearsed it angry, rehearsed it calm, rehearsed it defiant. She had once rehearsed it at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, going through every possible version of what she would say and what he would say, and how she would hold herself so that he could not see anything she didn't want him to see. None of her rehearsals had included the hole in the collar. "He likes feet," the king said, nodding toward Brutus, who had positioned himself beside Mara's left ankle and was regarding the king with the absolute indifference of someone who has no concept of rank. "In the night, he finds them. I've stopped trying to understand why." Mara looked down at the cat, then back up. "Is he yours?" she asked. "He lives here," the king said. "Whether he's mine is a question he has strong opinions about." He tilted his head slightly. "Did you sleep?" It was such an ordinary question that she almost did not answer it. It felt like a trap, not because it was designed as one but because no part of her framework for this situation had room for ordinary questions. She had built the framework around conflict, around being required to explain herself or defend herself or receive judgment. An ordinary question, from the man she had expected to be her judge, had the specific quality of something that didn't fit the container she'd made for it. "Yes," she said. "Good." He looked down at Brutus, then back at her. "The steward will have breakfast ready in about 20 minutes if you want it. There's no requirement to attend." He paused, in the way that people pause when they are choosing the simplest version of something. "I wanted you to know it was there." She stared at him. He nodded once, the comfortable nod of a man who has said what he came to say and is not in any hurry. And then he turned and walked back down the hallway with his mug of something hot and his hole in his collar and his decidedly uncomposed hair, and Brutus, with a twitch of his large orange tail, followed him. She stood in the doorway of her room and watched them go. She was waiting for the part where this made sense. She went to breakfast, not because she was hungry, she was slightly, but that was not the reason. She went because not going felt like ceding territory she had not agreed to cede, which was a complicated way of saying she was not going to let him think she was hiding in her room. She was not hiding, she was observing. There was a difference. The breakfast room was smaller than she expected, and it was in the domestic wing rather than any formal dining area. She had expected a long table and tall chairs and the spatial vocabulary of power. Instead, it was a round table near a window, 4 chairs around it, a sideboard with food kept warm, and Brutus sleeping on a cushion by the radiator like an argument that had already settled itself. The king was already there, sitting at the table with a newspaper and a plate of toast, and the most genuinely unconcerned expression she had ever seen on a man who had reason to be concerned. He glanced up when she came in. "There's eggs," he said, "and something Claire calls herb bread, which I think is regular bread with ambitions." She went to the sideboard and filled a plate, eggs, the herb bread, which turned out to be quite good, a small dish of something she couldn't identify but which smelled of apples and cardamom. She sat down at the table, not across from him, that felt too deliberate, too much like a negotiation, but at the chair to the left, which was neither close nor distant. He went back to his newspaper. She ate. Brutus snored softly from the cushion. The silence was not uncomfortable, and she found this more disturbing than she wanted to admit. She had expected tension, the tight, loaded silence of two people in a room who both know something needs to be said. Instead, it was simply quiet in the way that kitchens are quiet in the morning, with the sound of silver on plates and the distant sound of someone moving around in other rooms and the occasional ruffle of a newspaper page. She had prepared for conflict. She did not have a framework for sitting at someone's breakfast table eating good herb bread while a large cat slept nearby. "Why am I here?" she said. She had not planned to say it yet, but the quiet had a way of holding questions up to the light, and this one had been pressing against the back of her teeth since Tuesday. He set down the newspaper. He looked at her not sharply, not with the flat assessment of a man deciding what to do with a problem, but with the kind of direct, even attention that suggested he had been waiting for the question and had already thought about how to answer it honestly. "There are things I should have told you 5 years ago," he said. "I didn't, I'm going to now." She kept her expression exactly where it was. "That's not an answer to what I asked," she said. "No," he agreed, "it's an answer to a better question." He picked up his toast, bit it, chewed with the unaffected practicality of a man eating toast rather than performing the eating of toast. "You asked why you're here. The reason you're here is that I could not figure out how to put what I needed to tell you in a letter without it sounding like either a legal document or an apology, and I was not going to apologize in writing." She absorbed this. "You're going to apologize in person," she said. "I'm going to explain something in person," he said. "Whether you call it an apology afterward is up to you." She picked up her fork again and ate a bite of egg, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because it bought her a moment to think without him seeing her think. She was good at the face of not thinking. She had practiced it for years, in places where showing that you were thinking was the same as showing your hand. He went back to his newspaper, which she found, after a moment, was somehow the right thing to do. He was not pressing. He was not watching her process what he had said and waiting for her reaction. He was eating toast and reading about something, and the information he had just given her was sitting on the table between them like a dish she could look at whenever she was ready. She ate her breakfast. The herb bread was very good. She would not tell him that. After breakfast, Claire showed her the compound. This was, apparently, an offer rather than an instruction. Claire had knocked on her door mid-morning with the cheerful energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed showing people around, and had prefaced the offer with, "Only if you'd like, of course. There's no schedule you have to follow," in a way that Mara believed. She went because knowing the layout of a place was always useful, and because she was tired of sitting in her room cataloging the ceiling. The compound was larger than it looked from the outside, in the way that things built gradually over many decades tend to be, wings added at different times, hallways that connected to other hallways at angles that suggested they had not been planned together, rooms that had started as one thing and become another. Claire narrated it all with the fond familiarity of someone who had grown up within it, pointing out which corridor led to the kitchens, which staircase went to the upper library, which door opened onto the inner courtyard garden, and which door looked like it opened onto something interesting but was actually a broom cupboard. "He uses it as a broom cupboard," Claire said of the last one, with the easy informality of someone who had long since stopped feeling the need to add honorifics to everything. "Though I think it was a study at some point. There's still a desk in there." "A desk in the broom cupboard," Mara said. "He knows about it. I think he finds it funny." Mara filed this away beside the hole in the collar and the newspaper and the toast and the completely ordinary expression at the breakfast table. She was building a picture, and the picture was not what she had expected. She had expected a man shaped by power, defined by it, organized around it, the way men who have held authority for a long time often became the vessel for that authority rather than the person inside it. She had met those men before. They had a particular quality, a certain texture to their attention, as if they were always assessing whether the thing in front of them was useful or not, always running calculations just behind their eyes. The man she had sat across from at breakfast was reading a newspaper. The man Claire described with unconscious ease was someone who found broom-covered desks funny. She did not know what to do with this. The inner courtyard was the best part of the compound, a walled garden, stone paths, low herbs she could name by smell, a stone bench against the far wall that had the particular smoothness of a surface used for a long time by people who sat and thought. The morning had stayed gray but dry, and the garden held the quiet specific to enclosed outdoor spaces. She sat on the bench for a while. Brutus appeared, as if he had been informed of her location, and settled beside her on the stone with his paws tucked under his chest and his eyes mostly closed. She looked at the garden. She thought about what the king had said at breakfast, not an apology, an explanation. She thought about the 5 years she had spent expecting the knock on the door. She thought about the way he had said things I should have told you, as if there were specific things, as if there were information she did not have that he did. She thought about the decree she had argued against at the summit. She thought about the words she had chosen, which had been the right words but delivered in the wrong room at the wrong moment with the wrong permissions. She thought about the escort out of the building, the note in dark, even handwriting. She thought about all the things she had assumed. The problem with assumptions was that they were made of something real, real history, real evidence, real patterns in how the world tended to work. Her assumptions about King Callum Aldrich were not made of nothing. They were made of 5 years of silence where there could have been a knock on her door, 5 years of watching his territory from a distance and waiting, 5 years of flinching at boots on cobblestones. But they were also, she was beginning to suspect, made of a story she had told herself so many times it had started to feel like fact. She looked at Brutus. "What does he actually want?" she said. Brutus opened one eye, then closed it again. She had the distinct impression that the cat knew something, and found it personally amusing that she did not. She went back inside before the gray morning decided to become rain. Claire had left a fresh pot of tea in her room, and on the desk beside her notebook there was a small, plain card with neat handwriting, not the dark, even script she recognized, but something more hurried, Claire's she assumed. "The library on the upper floor is open to you any time, 3rd door on the right." She stood in the middle of her room and looked at the card. She thought about libraries. She had loved them her whole life in the way that people who did not have many books as children tend to love them, with a hunger that was not quite about reading, but about the idea of all that accumulated thought in one place, all those arguments and questions and answers, all that accumulated refusal to let things be forgotten. An open library. An ordinary breakfast. A broom cupboard with a desk. A king who had said, "I could not figure out how to put it in a letter without it sounding like an apology." She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. The garden was still there, gray and quiet. The stone bench was empty. The late-season flowers she didn't know the names of were holding their color against the overcast light, with the specific stubbornness of things that had not been told winter was coming. She was still cataloging exits, she noticed that. She was also, she admitted to herself, a little bit curious. She did not trust curiosity. It had gotten her into trouble before. It had gotten her standing at the back of a council summit 5 years ago, raising her voice in a room full of important people, saying the kind of thing that cannot be unsaid. But it had also, she thought, been the most honest thing she had ever done. She picked up the card from Claire. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in her notebook and went to find the 3rd door on the right. The soup arrived at 7:30, and she let it sit. This was not a decision so much as a condition. She had come back from the library, which was everything a library should be, and several things she hadn't expected, including a section on regional water policy that she found herself reading for 40 minutes without intending to, and found dinner waiting on a covered tray outside her door with a small folded note tucked under the handle of the serving dish. The note said, "The soup is better if you don't let it sit." She recognized the handwriting. She carried the tray inside, set it on the desk, removed the cover, looked at the soup, which was a deep amber color with the smell of something slow-cooked and patient, and then sat on the bed and looked at it from a distance. It was, she understood, soup. It was not a declaration. It was not a move in a strategy. It was a pot of soup that someone had arranged to be brought to her room because it was dinner time and she was a person who needed to eat dinner. This was all it was, and she knew this, and she sat on the bed and looked at it anyway, because the part of her brain that had been trained for the last 5 years to find meaning in every gesture from this particular household was not willing to accept that something could simply be soup. She thought about the note. The soup is better if you don't let it sit. That was not a warning. That was not a message with subtext. That was the kind of thing a person said when they knew the soup and wanted you to have it at its best. She tried to imagine a version of events in which King Callum Aldrich, who could have, at any point in the past 5 years, done something about her, who had every resource of an entire territory at his disposal, who had been openly challenged in front of 300 people by a 19-year-old from a small village who was, by any formal measure, no one had arranged for her to come here specifically so that he could, what? Make her feel guilty about cold soup. She sat with that for a moment. She let the soup sit for exactly 40 minutes. She counted. She was not sure what she was proving, but something in her required that she prove it. Then she got up, walked to the desk, picked up the spoon, and tried the soup. It was excellent, even cold. She resented this and ate it all. The next morning she woke before the gray of the sky had decided what color it wanted to be, and she lay in bed for a while in the particular suspension of early morning when thoughts arrive without much ceremony. She thought about Claire, who had shown her the compound with such genuine pleasure in doing so. She thought about Nora, who had driven her for 4 hours without performing conversation. She thought about the steward, who had given her the meal schedule in the same tone one would use to describe any practical arrangement, not the managing tone of a guard, not the deferential tone of a host trying to impress, just information offered to a person who needed it. She thought about Brutus, who had appeared again before she slept, sitting outside her door until she let him in, and who was currently a warm and unmoving weight against her left hip. She thought about the king. He was not what her 5-year picture had built. This was the fundamental problem, and she was trying to be honest with herself about it rather than defensive, because she had a habit of being defensive about the things she had been wrong about, and she was working on this, had been working on it for years with partial success. Her 5-year picture had been built from the available evidence, a policy she had considered harmful, a room full of people who ignored her, a note in dark handwriting telling her to leave, and then 5 years of nothing. From this she had constructed a person, precise, cold, political, the kind of man who remembered slights and kept them filed away for when they became useful. But the man who had stood in her hallway in a sweater with a hole in it, asking if she'd slept, was not that person. Or if he was, he kept the cold precision very well hidden under a layer of genuine ordinariness that was either authentic or the most elaborate form of disarming she had ever encountered. She was not yet sure which. She got up, dressed, and went downstairs. He was already in the breakfast room. This seemed to be a habit. She got the impression he was always awake before most of the compound, probably from the kind of long-formed routine that people who carry large responsibilities build as a way of having a part of the day that belongs only to them. He had the newspaper again, and a plate with eggs and what appeared to be the same herb bread from yesterday, and a large mug of coffee. He looked up when she came in. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said, and went to the sideboard. "Brutus slept in your room again," he said. It was not a question. "He let himself in," she said. "He's worked out the latch. I should probably fix it, but he seems happier since you arrived, so." He turned a page of the newspaper. She sat down. She was thinking about what he had said at yesterday's breakfast, that he needed to explain something to her, that he hadn't been able to put it in a letter. He hadn't said it again. He hadn't pressed. She was waiting for him to bring it up, and he was reading his newspaper, and Brutus was on his cushion by the radiator, and the breakfast room was quiet in the same comfortable way it had been quiet yesterday. She had decided, somewhere in the suspended thinking of early morning, to stop waiting for him to bring it up. "You said you had something to tell me," she said, "yesterday at breakfast." He set down the paper. This time he did not look surprised that she had raised it. He looked, if anything, like someone who had been wondering when she would. "I did," he said. "So tell me." He looked at her for a moment in the direct, even way that she was starting to recognize, not an assessing look, not a calculating one, but the look of a man deciding how to be accurate rather than tactical. He put his coffee down. The morning after the summit, he said, I had the decree pulled. She stopped. What? She said. The one you argued against, I had it pulled from ratification. It was revised 3 times over the following month, and what was finally issued was substantially different from what was presented at the summit, specifically in the provisions regarding the distribution assessments in the outer districts. He said this without any particular inflection, the way someone states a fact that is simply a fact. Your village, Creslow, yes, was in one of those districts. The revised provisions were more favorable. She was very still. You changed it, she said. We changed it, he said. The team changed it, but the argument that moved the revision process was yours. She looked at her plate, she looked at the herb bread she had not yet eaten, she looked at her coffee, she looked at him. Why didn't anyone, she started. Because I was 26 years old and embarrassed, he said, with a directness that was so sudden it almost startled her. And because my advisors at the time told me that publicly acknowledging the argument of someone who had, in their words, disrupted formal council proceedings was not advisable. And because I was, at 26, still at the stage of listening to my advisors about things I later understood they were wrong about. He picked up his coffee. None of those are good reasons, they're just the ones I had. She sat with this. She could feel it moving through her, not with the force of something dramatic, not with the clean relief she might have expected if she had ever imagined this conversation. It moved through her the way cold water moves through a closed room when a window is finally opened. Not comfortable, not dramatic, just present. Air where there had not been air. You didn't tell me, she said. No. For 5 years. Yes. She picked up her fork, she put it down again. She looked out the window at the garden, which was gray and still in the early morning, and she thought about the years she had spent inside a story that had a villain and a verdict and a waiting punishment that never came. She thought about how much of her energy those years had taken, how many times she had caught herself calculating, assessing, holding herself braced for something, how many exits she had catalogued in how many rooms. I wrote letters, she said, to the district office, 3 of them, asking why the decree had not been issued in its original form. No one wrote back. I know, he said. I found them later in correspondence files that should have been routed to me and weren't. That was also something that needed fixing. He paused. I'm not going to tell you that the system worked. It didn't, in several directions at once. She looked at him. Why now, she said. Why bring me here 5 years later to tell me this? He was quiet for a moment. Not the evasive quiet of someone avoiding a question, but the considered quiet of someone making sure they answered it correctly. Because I came across something in the district review files last month, he said. An annotation. Someone in the records office, probably the same department you work in, had gone through the old correspondence and flagged your letters with a note that said no response issued, reason unknown. And beside the flag, someone had written your name and the district you were from. And I recognized the name. He looked at her with the clear gray eyes. And I thought, she has been living for 5 years not knowing that she was right, and that it mattered. And that seemed like something that should not continue. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing something she did not have a ready word for. It was not relief, exactly. It was not gratitude. She was very careful about gratitude. She had learned to be, because gratitude could be a trap, and because she did not want to be someone who felt grateful for simply being told the truth that should have been told to her years ago. What it was, she thought, was something closer to the specific ache of a thing that had been held wrong for so long that even being put right couldn't erase the shape of the holding. She picked up her fork and ate a bite of egg. The herb bread is good, she said. He blinked once, then something shifted very slightly in his expression, not quite a smile but the predecessor of one, the country a smile comes from before it makes itself known. Claire makes it, he said. She puts rosemary in it and then acts like it's a mystery why it tastes good. They ate for a while without speaking. The morning light was starting to come through the window, thin and pale, the winter-adjacent light of a season that had not quite decided to let go yet. Brutus shifted on his cushion and stretched with the elaborate luxury of something that has no concept of wasted time. She thought about Creslow. She thought about her mother who had not lived to see the revision. She thought about the winter the decree had been presented and the fear in the village that year low sustained, the kind of fear that comes from not knowing what is coming next and having very few ways to find out. She had been 19. She had taken herself to that summit on saved bus fare and sheer stubbornness, with a petition in her coat pocket and the conviction that if she could just get someone to listen. Someone had listened. She had not known. For 5 years she had not known, and he had known, and he had not told her, and the not telling had done its own kind of damage, not the same damage as if the decree had stood unchanged, but damage that had lived in her in a different way. In the bracing, the cataloguing, the steady, exhausting work of being ready. She looked at him across the breakfast table. He was eating his toast. He was not watching her process this. He had given her the information and he was eating his toast and letting her be where she was with it, which was either deeply considerate or the kind of thing you did when you understood that a person needed room to feel something without someone watching them feel it. She was not yet sure which. She was leaning toward the former. She got up, brought the teapot from the sideboard, refilled her cup, and then, without quite deciding to, refilled his without asking. He glanced up. She sat back down. He did not say anything, but he picked up the cup, and there was something in the small, ordinary act of that, the refilling, the pickup, the silence, that felt like a shift in the atmosphere that she could not name precisely, but that she registered in her body before she registered it anywhere else. She had not trusted a single person in a position of power over her since she was 14 years old. She was not trusting him yet, she was clear on that. What she was doing was something more preliminary. She was updating the file. She was taking out the picture she had built of this man, and sitting with the fact that it was missing large pieces, and that missing pieces' pictures should be held loosely rather than presented as finished. She was learning to hold this one loosely. It was difficult. She had been holding it very tightly for a very long time. After breakfast she went to the library again, and she sat in the window seat with her notebook, and she wrote for a while. Not the kind of writing she did for work, careful, structured, the processing of information into records, but the kind she did when she needed to put something outside her body so she could look at it. She wrote what he had told her. She wrote what she had felt when he told her. She wrote the specific shape of the 5-year story she had built, and she wrote beside it the specific shape of what she now knew to be true, and she looked at the difference. The difference was significant. She was looking at it steadily, which was all she had to offer herself right now. At some point, without her noticing the transition, Brutus appeared on the window seat beside her. She had not heard him come in. She was almost certain the library door had been closed, and she was choosing not to investigate this, and settled his considerable weight against her hip, and they sat together in the pale morning light, the woman and the cat, while the garden below went about the quiet business of being a garden in late autumn. And somewhere in the compound, a man with a hole in his collar was doing whatever it was that kings did before noon. She was still on guard. She was also, she admitted, very slightly less certain that she needed to be. She turned to a fresh page in her notebook. She wrote at the top, "What do I actually know?" Below it, in careful list form, she wrote what she knew, not what she assumed, not what she had extrapolated, what she actually knew. The list was shorter than she expected. She was still looking at it when Claire knocked on the open library door an hour later to say that lunch was ready whenever she wanted it. No pressure at all. "Thank you," Mara said. "Oh, and he asked me to mention," Claire said, with the easy way she had of saying things as if they were perfectly unremarkable, "that if you wanted to look at the revised decree, the one from 5 years ago, he has a copy in the study. He said you're welcome to it whenever you like." Mara looked at her notebook. The list sat there, short and honest, waiting to be added to. She closed the notebook. "Tell him thank you," she said. She went down to lunch. She ate with appetite, which was something she hadn't done since the letter arrived on Tuesday. She ate all of it, and she did not let it sit. He had a habit of asking before he sat. She noticed it on her 4th day at the compound, during what had become, without either of them formally announcing it, their standard morning arrangement. She was in the library with her notebook and the window seat and approximately 1,100 pages of water policy history spread around her in a way she would have been embarrassed about if she were anywhere but a library, when he appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs and tilted one in her direction with a look that was clearly a question. She nodded. He came in, set 1 mug near her elbow, not on her notebook, not within reach of her papers, in the one available patch of surface that was both close enough to be useful and far enough not to crowd anything she was working with. And then, before settling into the chair across the table, he said, "Is this all right? I can go." She looked at him. You brought me coffee, she said. I can also take the coffee and go, he said, if you're in the middle of something. I'm reading about the 1987 District Water Assessment Protocol, she said. That's not an answer. I'm not in the middle of something that can't be interrupted, she said. He sat. This was the thing, the asking before sitting. It was not performative. She had been watching for performance since she arrived, with the particular vigilance of someone who had spent a long time in environments where performance was the primary mode of relating, where things were said not because they were true, but because they produced a desired response, and where the gap between what was said and what was meant was something you learned to navigate the way you navigated a landscape full of unmarked holes. She had become very good at spotting the gap. There was no gap here. He asked before he sat because he genuinely wanted to know if she wanted company. This, she thought, was either very simple or very disarming, and the problem was that it had exactly the same surface presentation in both cases. She sipped the coffee. It was good, much better than what she made for herself in her room with the small kettle Claire had left her. She filed this away with the tea and the soup and the herb bread and the frankly unnecessary quality of everything that had been offered to her in this compound, and tried to identify what pattern it formed. He had opened one of his own files on the table across from her, something with numbers, which he looked at with the focused attention of a man who was doing actual work and not simply providing the appearance of doing actual work. She returned to her reading. They worked in silence for what she estimated was about 40 minutes. It was a good silence. She had a calibrated understanding of silences, the taut ones, the evasive ones, the comfortable ones, the ones that were simply the absence of something that should have been said but wasn't. This silence was of the easy kind, the kind that existed between two people who did not need to fill space to justify being in it together. She did not entirely know what to do with that. Can I ask you something, she said, without looking up from the water assessment protocol. Yes, he said, without looking up from his numbers. At the summit, the one 5 years ago, she paused, organizing the question, when I stood up, what did you actually think in that moment? He was quiet long enough that she looked up. He was looking at the ceiling in the way people look at the ceiling when they are not looking at the ceiling, but at something inside themselves. I thought, he said slowly, that you were going to get thrown out before you finished speaking, and I wanted you to finish speaking. He brought his gaze down to the table, then to her, which put me in the position of either stopping the escort, which would have required me to do it visibly, in front of everyone, which had political implications I did not want, or staying quiet and hoping the escort would be slow. The escort was not slow, she said. No, he looked at her steadily. You made it through what you needed to say, though, by about 15 seconds. She thought about those 15 seconds. She thought about standing at the back of that room with 300 faces turned toward her, some hostile, some blank, some she had not let herself look at his. She had known if she looked at his she would lose her nerve, and she couldn't afford to lose her nerve. You looked at me, she said. When I started speaking, you stopped writing. I did, he said. And then the escort came. Yes. She looked at the window. Outside, the garden was doing its patient autumn thing, gray and still. The note, she said, the one that was passed to me saying I would be escorted out, was that from you? Yes, he said. It came very quickly. I wrote it before you finished speaking, he said. I wrote it as soon as I understood what was happening. He met her eyes. It said you would be escorted out. It did not say you were wrong. I thought, he paused again. I thought you would understand the difference. She looked at him for a long moment. I was 19, she said, and I was being walked out of a building by two large men. I was not reading subtext at that particular moment. Something crossed his face, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a person confronting the gap between what they had intended and what had actually landed. No, he said, that was my mistake. I was 26 and thinking about the room I was managing, not the person I was removing from it. Those are not the same thing. She returned to her water assessment protocol. He returned to his numbers. But the room had shifted slightly. Some small additional weight had been acknowledged and put down, which made the air slightly lighter. After lunch, he asked if she wanted to see the revised decree. He said it the same way he said everything, directly, without preamble, without any apparent anxiety about whether she would say yes or no. The copy is in the study. Whenever you want to look at it, it'll be there. She said she did. The study was on the ground floor of the East Wing, and it was clearly a room that was used, not the formal display of a room people used for appearances, but the lived disorder of a space where actual thinking happened. There were books on the desk, and books on the chairs, and books on the floor beside the chairs. There were papers in several organized piles that managed to look organized despite their number. There was a map on the wall covered in pencil notations that she very much wanted to read more closely, but restrained herself. There was a small window that looked out onto the courtyard, and the light came through it at a comfortable angle, and there was a plant on the windowsill that was somewhat overdue for water. He went to the desk, opened a lower drawer, and produced a folder that was, she noted, not filed away in some archive but kept within arm's reach. He handed it to her. She sat in one of the bookless chairs and read it. He stood at the window and looked at the courtyard. The document was thorough. She was not a policy person by training. She had learned what she knew from necessity, and from the records work that had given her access to the kind of paperwork that most people never saw, but she understood enough to read what had been changed, and how, and where the language had shifted from the theoretical to the specific. The provisions for the outer districts were not just revised, they were rebuilt from a different foundation, one that started with what those districts actually produced and actually needed, rather than with what the central projection models assumed they produced and needed. There was a specific subsection about villages with seasonal income variation. She recognized the arguments in it. They were her arguments, the ones she had made in the 20 minutes she had been allowed to speak, translated into the formal structure of policy document language. She was reading her own words, in official print, in a document that had been quietly implementing her ideas for 5 years. She sat with this for a moment. "You kept a copy," she said. "In the drawer," he said, without turning from the window. "Why?" He turned then, he looked at her with the direct gray eyes. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said, "and the reason it was right came from you. That seemed worth keeping close." She looked back down at the document. She was thinking about Creslow, about the winter of that year, how the fear in the village had been a specific fear, not dramatic, not the fear of sudden calamity, but the low, grinding fear of people who understood that a decision made in a city 3 hours away would change the texture of their daily lives and that they had no way to change it back. She had felt it herself deeply. She had sat with her mother at their kitchen table and looked at what they knew of the decree and done the math, and the math was not kind. The decree had not issued as written. The math had not been required. Her mother had not lived to the end of that winter, but she had lived through it without the additional weight of what the original policy would have added. That was something. It was not everything, but it was something. And for the first time in 5 years, she was allowing it to be something rather than erasing it under the weight of what had not been said and what had not been done. She closed the folder and held it in her lap. "I would like to say something," she said. "All right," he said. "When I stood up at that summit, I was not trying to embarrass you. I want to be clear about that. I was not interested in you particularly. I was interested in the people in my village who were going to have their lives changed by a piece of paper that nobody was going to ask them about. And I was," she paused, finding the right word. "Angry, yes, but the anger was not about you." He nodded. "I know," he said. "I knew that at the time." "Then why," she said, "did your advisors treat it as a personal attack?" "Because advisors who have held their positions for a long time learn to read everything in relation to the person they advise," he said. "It's a professional deformation. Everything becomes about the king, including the things that aren't." "And you let that reading stand," she said. "For longer than I should have," he said. "Yes." She thought about this. "You were 26, she said. "That's not an excuse." "I didn't say it was an excuse, I said it was true." She looked at him. "You were 26 and you were managing a room full of people who had opinions about how you should handle everything, including a 19-year-old from Creslow who wouldn't stay quiet. And you made decisions that were imperfect." She set the folder on the desk beside her. "I was also 19, and I stood up in a formal council chamber and made a scene. I also made imperfect decisions." He looked at her with an expression that was new, not the ordinary calm he wore most of the time, but something that was almost startled. As if being spoken to this way was not something he had arranged for and was not entirely sure what to do with. "You're being very fair," he said. "I'm being accurate," she said. I find they're easier to maintain when they're the same thing. Brutus walked in from somewhere, the study door had been open, and went directly to the man near the window, butting his large head against his knee with the decisive affection of an animal that has made up its mind. He reached down and scratched the cat behind one ear automatically, without looking, in the practiced way of someone who has done this thousands of times and does not need to think about it. She watched this for a moment. "He likes you," she said. "He tolerates me," he said. "He likes you. He sits on my feet in the night." That's essentially the highest form of Brutus endorsement. He's never done it with anyone but me. He glanced down at the cat, then back at her. "I'm genuinely not sure how to take that." She looked at the map on the wall. She looked at the pencil notations on it, the careful markings of someone who thought geographically, who processed the world in terms of where things were in relation to each other. "The notation on the eastern border," she said, because she could not help it. "Is that the new district boundary or the proposed one?" He looked at the map. "Proposed," he said, "still under review. The current boundary cuts through a watershed that should be treated as a single unit, but 3 different administrative designations say otherwise." He paused. "Do you want to look at the maps?" She looked at him. "I work in records," she said. "I know," he said. That was my answer to my own question. He moved the folder from the desk chair, sat in it, and opened the desk drawer that had held the decree folder. Below it was a wider drawer with rolled maps inside, and he laid one flat on the desk with the ease of someone who spent a lot of time with maps, and she got up from the book chair and went to look. They spent the next 2 hours looking at maps. He talked about the watershed. She asked about the administrative designations and why they cut where they did, which was a good question and which led to a conversation about the historical boundaries that preceded the current ones, which led to a map of the older markings, which led to her pointing out something she recognized from the water assessment records in the library and him saying, "Where did you read that?" with a sharpness of interest that was not skepticism but its opposite. The sharpness of someone who has been thinking about a problem and has just been handed a piece they didn't have. She told him where she had read it. He wrote it down. She noticed that, the writing it down, he did not simply nod. He wrote it down in a small notebook he kept on the desk, in careful handwriting, with her name beside it in brackets as the source. She did not comment on it. But she noticed it, and she filed it away, and the file was getting heavy in a direction she had not originally expected it to go. They did not eat lunch until 2:30, which neither of them had noticed until Claire appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of someone managing schedules on behalf of people who were reliably terrible at them. They ate in the small sitting room off the kitchen because the breakfast room was being used, and they ate standing up in a way that Mara found unexpectedly comfortable, the informal meal of 2 people who had been working and were continuing to think while they ate. She told him about a notation she had found in the old records, a minor thing, a discrepancy in a district log that didn't quite add up. He leaned against the counter and listened with the full attention of someone who was not performing listening but actually doing it, and then he said, "The log from that year is in the second archive," and she said, "How do you know that?" and he said, "I looked for your letters after I found them in the files." She stopped. "You went looking for my correspondence," she said. "After I realized it had been misdirected," he said straightforwardly. "Yes." "How much of it did you find?" "The 3 letters you wrote to the district office, a petition from your village council that was filed without notation, and a complaint you wrote to the regional administrator about a road inspection that I believe is a separate matter, but I was being thorough." She put down her plate. "You read my complaint about the road inspection." "It was well argued," he said. "The road is fixed now incidentally." She looked at him. Something was happening in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. It was not entirely comfortable, but it was not bad, and in her experience, the things that were not entirely comfortable and not bad were usually the things that mattered. She picked up her plate and finished her lunch. "The watershed boundary," she said, "the proposed one. If you shift it west by the water line rather than the administrative line, it would encompass the full catchment area." He looked at her. "That's what I've been trying to get the review panel to understand for 8 months, he said. "Do you want me to write it down?" she said. He handed her the small notebook. There is a particular quality of light in Creslow in November that she has never been able to find anywhere else. It has to do with the way the valley sits, low between two ridges, so that the morning light comes in sideways and long, catching the edge of things rather than the face of them, and making even ordinary objects look like they're holding something back. The stone walls look golden. The mud looks like something deliberate. The smoke from the chimneys stands straight up in the cold air and looks almost formal. She was 12 the first time she noticed it. She had been on her way to the village school, walking the lane that ran alongside the old Merton orchard, and the light had hit the frost on the fence posts in that particular way, and she had stopped and looked at it for a long time, long enough that she was late for school, and her teacher, Mrs. Alden, had given her the look that teachers give to children who arrive late and offer no convincing reason. She had thought about that light for the rest of the day. She had thought about the way it made the world look larger and more important than it usually did, and she had thought about how strange it was that the same world that looked this way in the morning would look perfectly flat and ordinary by afternoon, and that no one else seemed to notice. This was the first memory she had that belonged entirely to herself, not to the village, not to her mother, not to the long story of the family in Creslow that went back generations, just to her. A girl on a lane in November, stopped dead by the light on frost. She was thinking about it now because it was November again, and she was 2 days away from the anniversary of something she did not think of as an anniversary, but which her body always seemed to remember before she did. Her mother had died in the second week of November 5 years ago, 3 weeks before the summit. She had not told anyone at the compound this. She had not told anyone in Ashford this either, because she was not in the habit of offering grief to people who hadn't asked for it, and she was not in the habit of performing grief in ways that required witnesses. She had her own arrangements for the anniversary. She had kept them for 5 years. A quiet day, her mother's recipe for the apple cake she had made every winter, and the November light wherever she could find it. She did not have a kitchen here, she was a guest. She was standing at her window on the morning of the 9th of November, looking at the garden, which was bare now, the last flowers gone, the hedges clipped, the stone paths grey and patient, and she was thinking about Creslow and Mrs. Alden and the light on frost, when Brutus appeared on her bed behind her and made the small sound that he made when he wanted acknowledgement. She turned and scratched him between the ears. "I know," she said to him, which was nonsensical, but Brutus received it with dignity. She had been at the compound for 12 days. In 12 days, her framework for what this was and what it meant had changed so many times that she had stopped trying to update it after each change, and had instead started keeping a running list of what she actually knew, adding to it when she learned something new, returning to it when she felt the pull of assumption. The list was long now. She knew that the king woke early. She knew that he ate the same breakfast most days with the contentment of someone who genuinely liked those things, rather than someone who had stopped paying attention. She knew that he listened when people talked, really listened, in the way that was noticeably different from the version of listening where someone held a polite expression and waited for their turn, and that he wrote things down in the small notebook with her name in brackets when she said something that mattered to the watershed problem or to any of the half-dozen other things they had ended up discussing in the library or the study or at the round breakfast table over the herb bread. She knew that his advisors frustrated him in a way he had clearly spent years learning to manage, and that the management was imperfect, and that he was aware the management was imperfect. She knew that he had 2 people he called friends, not just advisors, an older man named Henry who sent letters with very small handwriting that he sometimes read aloud to Brutus for reasons that were never entirely clear, and a woman in the South District named Petra who appeared to be the only person he actively argued with, in writing, about everything from agricultural drainage to the correct way to make tea. She knew that he had not slept well for a long time. She had worked this out from the lights. The compound was dark by 9, all the staff gone to their own quarters, but the study light stayed on. She had not meant to notice, but her room faced the east wing and the study window was visible, and the light was there at 11 and at midnight and once at 1:30. She had added this to the list without comment. And she knew this was the hardest thing on the list, the one she kept returning to, that she had been wrong about him. Not partially wrong in the way that was easy to absorb. Substantially wrong, in the way that required looking directly at 5 years of a particular story, and admitting that the story had been built on a misreading, and that the misreading had cost her something she had not been able to name before and could not quite name now, but that lived in the chest in the general area of all the other things that cost without being itemized. She had been braced for 5 years against someone who was not what she had braced against. That was not his fault entirely. He had made mistakes, real ones he had named clearly and not minimized. But the bracing had been hers. The architecture of vigilance had been hers. The cataloging of exits in every room she entered, hers. She had built it to survive a threat that had been, in its actual form, much smaller than the one she had imagined. She was not sure yet what to do with that. She got dressed and went downstairs. The breakfast room was empty. This was unusual, he was always there before her. She went to the sideboard, filled her plate, poured her coffee, and sat at the table and ate alone, which she did not mind but which felt slightly different than the last 12 mornings. Claire came in at some point with a fresh pot of coffee, and Mara asked where he was. The council call, Claire said, with the comfortable familiarity of someone who managed this schedule daily. They run long, he said to start without him. I did, Mara said. Claire smiled and left. She ate her breakfast. She thought about the summit, not the way she usually thought about it, which was as a fixed and settled thing, a scene that had happened in a specific way and produced specific consequences, but in the new way, the rearranged way, the way she was still learning to see it. She had gone to that summit 3 weeks after her mother's funeral. She had not told anyone this at the time. She had taken the bus from Creslow to Ashford on the money she'd been setting aside for 3 months, with the petition in her coat pocket, and the knowledge that she was doing it because her mother would have been the one to go and now couldn't, which meant it fell to her, which meant she was going to do it or she was going to have to live with not doing it, and she had made her choice before she boarded the bus. She had been running on grief and stubbornness, and the specific energy that comes from doing something in honor of someone who can no longer see you do it. She had walked into that council chamber and she had found a seat at the back, and she had sat for 2 hours listening to delegates speak about a policy that would change her mother's village, that would have changed her mother's life, if her mother had lived into it, in language so detached from the actual human reality of what it would change that she had felt the words landing on her like a kind of low-grade insult. She was not sorry she had stood up. She was not sorry for a single word she had said. What she was now in the rearranged version was aware that the person she had said it to was not the person she had spent 5 years believing he was. This was not an easy thing to be aware of. It would have been, in some ways, simpler if he had been what she thought. Simple villains were satisfying in their own grim way. They gave you something to aim the weight of experience at, somewhere to put the years of tension, a comprehensible target for all that careful vigilance. What she had instead was a complicated person who had made real mistakes and was honestly accounting for them, and who had, in the 12 days she had been here, extended toward her a consistent and genuine consideration that did not seem to want anything in return except possibly her opinion on water policy. That was not a simple villain, that was a person, and people were considerably harder to manage than villains. She was on her 2nd cup of coffee when he came in, looking like someone who had spent the last hour on a very long council call. There was a particular quality to his jaw, a settled-down tension that suggested something had been held for a while and was now being released. He went to the sideboard, filled a plate, poured the coffee, and sat at the table with the expression of a man who needed a moment before he was ready to speak about the last hour of his life. She gave him the moment. He ate half his toast. Then, 14 people, he said. 14 people on a council call, and 12 of them had the same 3 opinions, repeated in different order for 55 minutes. What were the opinions, she said. He told her. She listened. At the end, she said, the 3rd one is right, but it's missing the part about the secondary supply chain. And he put down his toast and looked at her with the expression he had when she said something that moved something in his thinking. Where did you read about the secondary supply chain? He said. I didn't read it anywhere, she said. I grew up adjacent to it. Creslow sits at the junction of 2 delivery routes for the outer eastern villages. If you change the eastern allocation without adjusting the routing, you displace the bottleneck rather than removing it. He looked at her for a long moment. Would you write that down? He said. You have a notebook, she said. I have a meeting in 2 hours, he said, with the 3 opinion people. She looked at him. Then she held out her hand for the notebook. She wrote the argument down, clearly, in the structured way she had learned at the records office, the way that made information easy to trace and easy to cite. She wrote the principle and then the specific and then the consequence, which was the correct order if you wanted someone who disagreed with you to follow the logic rather than resist the conclusion. She handed it back. He read it again. "You should be in these meetings," he said. The sentence landed differently than she expected, not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation, stated directly, the way he said most things. But it landed and it stayed, and she looked at her coffee cup and thought about what it meant to be told, by the man who had watched her be walked out of a council chamber 5 years ago, that she should be in the room. "I was once," she said, briefly. "You would not be walked out this time," he said, looking at the notebook. "No," she said, "I know." There was a small silence. Outside, the garden was doing its bare November thing. A bird landed on one of the stone paths and looked around with the alert dissatisfaction of a bird who has arrived and found the situation wanting, then left. "My mother died in November," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out in the small silence, the way things sometimes come out when you are not performing your own company, when you are simply present with someone, and the words arrive without having been sent for. He looked up from the notebook. She did not look at him, she looked at the garden. 5 years ago," she said, "second week, I was at the summit 3 weeks after. I've never told anyone that." She did not know why she was telling him. She was examining this in real time with one part of her attention, the way she sometimes examined herself when she did unexpected things, not with judgment, but with honest curiosity about what she was actually doing. What she was actually doing, she thought, was giving him something true, without strategy. Without the protective instinct that usually governed what she offered to people in positions of power. Just a true thing, shared, because the room had felt safe enough to hold it. She was not sure when the room had started to feel safe. She had not issued the permission. Her body had made its own arrangements again. "I'm sorry," he said. He said it simply, without addition. Not "I'm sorry for your loss" or "I'm sorry to hear that," or any of the formulas that people used when they didn't know what else to offer. Just the two words in the level voice meaning what they said. She nodded. She picked up her coffee. She would have liked the revised decree, she said. She was the kind of person who liked it when things were fixed. She found broken things personally offensive. "Good standard to have," he said. She had very high standards generally, Mara said. She also had a recipe for apple cake that I have been thinking about since Tuesday. He looked at her. "The kitchen is yours to use," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't ask for that," she said. "No," he agreed. "You were thinking about apple cake. It occurred to me that you might want to make it. The kitchen is fully stocked and Claire is off today, so no one will be in your way." She looked at the table. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Creslow, small, dark-wooded, always smelling of the dried lavender her mother kept in a bowl on the windowsill. She thought about the apple cake, which was not complicated to make, but required a certain amount of care at the right moments, and which she had made every November for 5 years in her small apartment in Ashford, standing at the counter with her mother's handwritten recipe card propped against the kettle. She had not brought the recipe card. She had the recipe in her head, where she had always kept it as a backup, because she was careful with the things she could not replace. "All right," she said. She spent the afternoon in the kitchen. It was a good kitchen, large and practical, with the organized abundance of a space that fed a household daily. She found everything she needed without much searching, and she worked in the quiet of the empty kitchen with the particular attention that cooking for the dead requires, which is different from cooking for the living. Slower, more deliberate, not about feeding someone, but about holding someone's presence in your hands. She peeled apples. She thought about the November light in Creslow and about Mrs. Alden, and about her mother walking the same lane to the same orchard in the same light, maybe stopping the same way, maybe seeing the same thing. She did not hear him come in. He appeared at the kitchen doorway at some point in the mid-afternoon with a mug in each hand and the question look, and she nodded, and he set one mug on the counter beside her workspace and sat at the kitchen table with the other and didn't say anything, and she continued peeling apples. It was not uncomfortable. When the cake was in the oven, he asked if the kitchen was supposed to smell that good or if something had gone wrong, and she told him it was supposed to, and he said he would take her word for it since his contribution to the cooking process was primarily staying out of it, and she said that was a reasonable contribution, and he almost smiled. They waited for the cake together in the warm kitchen, with the November light fading outside the window over the garden, and Brutus came in at some point and arranged himself under the table with the approval of an animal who knows when a room is being used well. She thought about the 5-year story. She thought about the bracing. She thought about her mother, who had been a practical person and had trusted practical evidence and had always said, "Look at what a person does, not at what a person could do." She looked at what he had done. It was not nothing. The cake came out well. She cut 2 pieces and put them on plates, and she set one on the kitchen table in front of him, and he looked at it with genuine interest, and she sat across from him and picked up her fork. "To your mother," he said simply. She looked at him. "To my mother," she said. She ate the first bite of November apple cake in a kitchen that was not her own, in a compound that was not her home, across from a man she had spent 5 years believing wanted something terrible from her. The cake was exactly right. Her mother would have been satisfied. 2 weeks and 4 days in, she admitted to herself that she knew where all the exits were, and had not used any of them. This was the most honest accounting she had done since arriving, and she did it on a morning when she woke before Brutus appeared and lay in the grey pre-dawn looking at the ceiling of her room, which she had now been looking at for 17 days, and which she knew the way you know a face you see every morning, the small water stain near the corner, the crack in the plaster that ran from east to west and then changed its mind. She knew where all the exits were. She had mapped them on day 1 as a habit, and she had updated the map as she learned the compound, and the map was complete. She could leave this room and be at the courtyard gate in approximately 4 minutes. She could be at the road in 7. She knew the direction of the nearest town from the road because she had noted it on the journey in, and she knew it was a 4-hour walk, but that there would be transport along that road before noon, because there was always transport along a main road before noon. She had this information. She had not used it. She had not used it because she had not needed it, and she had not needed it because the thing she had built the exit map against had not materialized, and 3 weeks in she was beginning to understand that it was not going to materialize, and she was adjusting. The adjusting was slow. It was not the kind of thing that happened in a conversation or a revelation. It happened in small, unglamorous ways, in the mornings when she woke and did not immediately catalog what she would need if she had to leave today, in the afternoons when she spent 2 hours with the maps and the policy files and forgot to keep one part of her attention at the door, in the evenings when she stayed in the library past dark because she was reading something interesting and had lost track of the time. She was losing track of the time. This had not happened to her in years. Brutus appeared at some point, as he always did, finding his way in through the latch he had learned to work, settling onto her feet with the weight and authority of something that considered this arrangement entirely reasonable. She lay in the grey dawn with the cat on her feet and the ceiling above her and the compound around her, and thought about the difference between safety and the absence of threat. She had lived for a long time in the absence of threat. She had built a life in Ashford that was quiet and functional and largely her own, and it was not threatened, and she had been able to move through it freely, and she had understood this as safety. What she was beginning to identify now was something slightly different. Not the absence of threat. She still couldn't say there was no threat here, because the calculus of trust required more time than she had given it, but the presence of something else. A quality in the air of this place that she had been trying to name for weeks, and that she was only now finding the right word for. The word was ease. Not her ease. She was not yet easy. She was too aware and too careful to be easy, but his ease. His settled, undemonstrative ease in his own space, in his daily routines, in the way he occupied a room without filling it up with his occupation of it. That ease had its own quality that spread, the way warmth in a room spread from a radiator. You didn't notice you were warmer until you moved to a colder room. She had noticed. Brutus snored. She got up. Breakfast was the standard arrangement. She arrived, he was there, he had the newspaper, she filled her plate, they ate. But this morning, coming in from outside where he appeared to have been standing in the garden for reasons she hadn't asked about, there was mud on his boots, which he did not seem to have noticed, and a small leaf caught in his hair at the back, which he definitely had not noticed. She did not tell him about the leaf. She sat down and ate her eggs and thought about whether to tell him about the leaf, and decided to wait and see how long it took someone else to tell him, and then thought about the fact that she was thinking about this, and what it indicated, and found the indication somewhat unsettling and also somewhat ordinary. He was reading something other than the newspaper this morning, a letter, with very small handwriting that she recognized as the Henry handwriting. He read it with an expression of affectionate exasperation that she had not seen on his face before and which looked, on the face that usually wore either calm attention or quiet focus, unexpectedly natural. "Good news," she said. "Henry," he said, "he's married again." "Again?" "Third time. He writes about it the same way he writes about everything, as if it is a sensible development that any reasonable person would have predicted." He folded the letter. "He is 71. His new wife is apparently a retired engineer who builds small bridges as a hobby." "Are they good bridges?" she said. He looked at the letter. "He says they are structurally sound and personally satisfying." "Then I think that's a success," she said. He looked at her, and there it was again, the country the smile came from, the expression that preceded it without becoming it. "I'll tell him you said so," he said. "He'll like you." She ate her toast and thought about this, about the fact that it was said with the ease of a future, the easy assumption that there would be a time when Henry could be told something, and that the telling would involve Mara's existence as a known thing. She did not challenge this. She let it sit and ate her toast. "There's a leaf," she said, "in your hair at the back." He reached up, found it, held it out and looked at it with mild interest. "I was in the garden," he said. "I gathered," she said. He dropped the leaf on the table and went back to his coffee. The morning after that, the letters arrived. She did not know there were letters until Claire mentioned them at mid-morning, bringing a fresh pot of tea to the library with the slightly careful expression of someone delivering information they are not entirely sure how the recipient will take. "There are 3 letters for you," Claire said. "In the post, from Ashford, Mr. Pace and 2 others." Mara looked up from the document she was reading. "Mr. Pace wrote me a letter," she said. "He did, it's quite long. He mentions the plants 3 times. Mara thought about the plants on her windowsill in Ashford, which were probably fine under Mr. Pace's supervision, since Mr. Pace had been tending his own window box for 40 years and had opinions about drainage that bordered on philosophical. She went down to collect the letters. There was one from Mr. Pace which was indeed quite long and covered the plants, his neighbor's new dog, the weather, a book he had found at the market and thought she might like, and a brief paragraph about a conversation he'd had with someone at the district office who had asked about her. He wrote the way he talked, in wide, comfortable loops, as if he had all the time in the world and intended to use it. There was one from her friend Diane at the records office, which was short and practical and asked 2 questions and expected 2 answers, and the last line of which said, "Are you all right? You look worried when you're not all right, and you can't write worried, but still, if you are." She was not worried, she had been worried. She was not currently worried. The 3rd letter was from a woman named Ruth, who had been her mother's closest friend in Creslow and who wrote to Mara twice a year, in November and in the spring, with the faithful rhythm of someone who understood that the people we love leave people behind who should be checked on. Ruth's letter was the shortest of the 3 and said the most. It said, "November again, she would have been so proud of you. She always was, but she would have been proud of what you've done with these years. Write when you can." She sat in the library with the letters in her lap and let herself feel what the letters contained, which was the world she had come from and the people in it, and the fact that they were still there, still writing, still maintaining the small threads of connection that people maintained across distances. She was not a person who cried easily. She was a person who felt things fully and quietly in the interior without requiring an external expression. But her eyes went warm for a moment with Ruth's letter, and she sat with that and let it be what it was. Brutus appeared. He always appeared. He walked in from wherever he had been. She had largely stopped trying to track his movements, since he appeared to operate by a logic entirely his own, and jumped into the window seat beside her and put his paw on her knee with the specific, deliberate gentleness of an animal who knows when a person needs something without knowing what the something is. She scratched his ears for a long time. That evening she went looking for him. She had not done this before, had always waited to encounter him in the natural rhythms of the compound, at breakfast, in the library, in the study during the map sessions that had become a regular feature of the afternoons. But she went looking, with Ruth's letter in her coat pocket and the particular feeling of someone who needs to talk to someone specific and has decided to stop not deciding this. She found him in the inner courtyard garden. It was dark by 6 at this point in November, and the courtyard was lit by the low lights that ran along the stone paths, and he was sitting on the bench against the far wall with his coat on and a cup of something. She suspected the perennial mug of some hot liquid, and Brutus was beside him, which confirmed she had been right about Brutus's evening location. He looked up when she came through the door from the domestic wing. "There's another bench in the potting shed if you want it," he said. "I'm all right," she said, and sat beside him on the bench. Not close but not distant, the middle distance that was neither. Brutus settled between them with the smugness of an animal who has achieved exactly the arrangement it wanted. The courtyard was quiet, the low lights made everything amber and dim, and the garden smelled of turned earth and the particular cold clean smell of November nights. "I got letters today," she said. "I saw them arrive," he said. "Good news." "Mr. Pace is taking good care of my plants," she said. "My friend Diane wants to know if I'm worried, and my mother's friend Ruth wrote." She looked at the amberlit path. "Ruth writes every November." He didn't say anything. He drank from his mug. "She said my mother would have been proud of me," Mara said, "for these years. The things I've done." "She would have been," he said. Mara looked at him. "You didn't know her," she said. "No," he said, "but I know you for 20 days, and I know what you've built, and I know what you did 3 weeks after burying her." He looked at the path, not at her. "That's not nothing, that's," he paused, "that's a particular kind of strength, the kind that comes from having been given a good example." She was quiet for a while. The courtyard held the quiet well. The lights were warm. Brutus pressed his side against her hip with the determined friendliness of an animal conducting his own therapeutic practice. "What happened to your family?" she said. She had not meant to ask this. It arrived the way the comment about her mother had arrived at the breakfast table, without being sent for, because the air between them had developed a quality in which true things arrived without ceremony. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she might have misjudged. "My father died when I was 19, he said. "My mother lives in the south wing of the old estate in Aldrich proper. She is well and very busy, and we talk on the first Sunday of every month, which is the frequency she prefers." He paused. "My sister married a man from the coast territories 8 years ago. She has children who I find I am better with each year, which I understand is a common development." "Children grow on you," she said. "Mine apparently took time," he said, with the dry quality he sometimes used for things that were both true and slightly self-deprecating. She looked at the garden. She thought about 19. She thought about what 19 looked like, her own, which had been grief and stubbornness and bus fare and a petition in a coat pocket. His, which had been the sudden and complete weight of a territory he had not finished growing into yet. They were not, she thought, so different in that. "I was angry at you for a long time," she said. "I want you to know that I know that most of it was misdirected." "Some of it wasn't," he said. "No," she agreed, "but most of it was." She paused. "The story I built about you in 5 years was larger than the thing that actually happened. It was the size of everything I didn't understand and couldn't explain. You became the place I put it all." He was looking at the path. "I understand that," he said. "I did the same thing in the other direction." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I made you smaller than you were," he said. "In the moment, 26 years old and managing a room and wanting everything to be manageable, I made you smaller. I reduced you to a disruption. That was its own kind of wrong." She sat with this. In the amber light of the courtyard, with the cold November air and the patient garden and Brutus between them like an affectionate argument in favor of warmth, she sat with the accounting between them, his mistakes, hers, the years between, the specific cost of the specific misreadings. "We're even then," she said, "approximately." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression she had not seen before, not the calm, not the focus, not the almost smile. Something that was more open than those things, more directly present. She held the look for a moment and then looked at the path because it was a lot, and she was learning to take a lot in increments. "You laughed today," she said. "In the study when the map slid off the desk. You laughed. I don't think I've heard you do that." He looked at the path. "I don't usually," he said. "There's no particular reason. I've just gotten out of the habit of laughing, of having something worth laughing at," he said, and there was nothing self-pitying in it, just a fact, stated with the matter-of-fact honesty he used for most things. She thought about what she was feeling. She thought about it directly with the honesty she tried to bring to things she wanted to understand. She was feeling, and this was strange, and she was noting it with precision, she was feeling something close to concern for him. Not pity, not sympathy exactly. Concern, the kind you feel for someone whose situation you have begun to care about. She had been here 20 days. She had spent 5 years building a prison for both of them, him as the warden, herself as the anticipated prisoner. And here they were in a courtyard in November, and neither of them was in a prison, and Brutus was between them, and the lights were amber, and he had been getting out of the habit of laughing. She was not going to say anything dramatic about this. "You should write to Henry," she said, "about the bridges." He looked at her. "I was going to." "Write tonight," she said. "Don't let it sit until you've planned what to say, just write." He considered this. "Like soup," he said. She looked at him. "I let the soup sit," she said. "That was a mistake I'm acknowledging." He almost smiled. "I know," he said. "Claire told me." "Claire told you." "She finds it charming," he said, "that you let it sit on principle." She looked at the garden and shook her head slowly, and realized in the small motion of shaking her head that something in her chest was lighter than it had been the day before. Not dramatically lighter, incrementally, the way things ease when you stop bracing against them. Brutus yawned expansively, showing all his teeth, and resettled with supreme confidence. She stayed on the bench for a while longer in the amber-lit November dark, not quite beside him and not quite not, and let the courtyard be what it was. She did not catalogue a single exit. The storm came on a Thursday, which, unlike Tuesday, gave no warning at all. She was in the library at noon when the light outside changed, not gradually, the way light usually changed in November, but all at once, as if someone had placed a hand over the sky. The garden below went from gray to the particular greenish dark that precedes serious weather, and then the first rain came sideways through the air and hit the library window with the flat authority of something that was not going to stop. She watched it for a moment. In Creslow, storms like this had a name, not an official name, but the kind of name that villages give to recurring things, a ridger, because they came in over the east ridge and dropped straight down, fast and total. She had grown up with them. She knew their rhythm, an hour of violence, then a slower hour, then the long damp evening after. She closed the window she had cracked for air earlier, settled back into the window seat, and went back to her reading. The rain sounded good against the glass, thick, continuous, the sound of a world rearranging its water. Brutus, who had been asleep in the chair across the room, got up, walked in a small circle, and got back down in the same spot, which she had come to understand was his rain protocol. She had been reading a study on bridge infrastructure in the eastern districts, a dry subject matter that she was finding less dry than expected, because the study had been written by someone who clearly cared about bridges beyond their administrative function, and had a habit of noting things like, "The oldest crossing here is locally called the Widow's Bridge," for reasons that the village residents explained differently depending on the season. She had started reading it because it related to the watershed question they had been working through, but she was staying in it because of the Widow's Bridge. She was 3 pages further in when the door opened. She glanced up. He came in with 2 mugs. This had become, without announcement, the standard arrangement for afternoons in the library. He looked at the window, and the rain beyond it with the expression of someone receiving information they were not surprised by. "The south path will flood," he said. "How long before it does?" she said. 20 minutes, maybe. It always floods from the corner where the old drain is." He handed her one of the mugs. Henry built a drain cover for it 3 years ago that held for exactly 1 winter. "Structurally sound," she said. "Personally satisfying," he said, and she saw the almost smile. He settled into the chair across the room, moving Brutus's theoretical presence aside to sit, even though Brutus was not in that particular chair at that particular moment but in the other one. He picked up the book he had left on the table beside the chair 2 days ago. She had noted it there, a history of the old administrative boundaries, which she had thought about reading before deciding to finish the watershed materials first. He opened it to his place. They read. She watched the rain for a moment, then returned to the Widow's Bridge. Outside, the garden bent and recovered and bent again, the hedges pulling against themselves with the patient energy of things that had been through this before and knew they would be asked to go through it again. An hour passed approximately. She knew because she had looked up twice and the light had shifted in between. The rain had not slowed. It had found its tempo and was committed to it. She could hear it on the roof above the library and on the courtyard stones below, and the sound built into something that was less like weather and more like a sustained note. She was reading about the bridge when she became aware that the lamp by his chair had gone on. He had reached over and switched it on against the darkening of the afternoon. And then, at some point after that, she became aware that he had stopped reading. She did not look up immediately. She turned her page, read the next paragraph, and then looked up. He was looking at the window, not with the distraction of someone whose mind has wandered, but with the attention of someone thinking about something specific. And the specific thing was visible on his face in the way that things were visible on his face when he forgot to maintain the ordinary calm, which he rarely forgot, but which the storm and the lamp and the enclosed room seemed to have loosened slightly. "What are you thinking about?" she said. He came back to the room. He looked at her. "The eastern boundary revision," he said. "I was trying to work out whether the panel can be moved on it before the end of the quarter or whether it runs into the next fiscal review." She considered this. If it runs into the next review, does it lose momentum? "It loses 2 members," he said, "both of whom are in favor of the revision. Their terms end in January." She thought about the maps. She thought about the pencil notations, the waterline, the proposed shift west. She thought about what she had written in the small notebook and what he had done with it. "Write the argument now," she said, "before January. Put it in front of the panel with the Creslow documentation, the records from the 5 years under the revised decree. The actual numbers, not the projections. People who argue against real numbers look like they're arguing against reality, which is a bad place to stand." He was looking at her with the focused attention. "I would need someone to compile the Creslow documentation," he said. "I know the records," she said. "I could compile it." He was quiet for a moment. "You came here as a guest," he said. "I know what I came here as," she said. "I'm offering to compile the records because I have them in my head and it would take me 3 days, and the alternative is watching you try to work around 2 panel members leaving in January." She looked at him. "You should have told me about the decree years ago. This doesn't balance that, but it's useful, and I don't believe in not being useful when I could be." He did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at her with an expression she was learning to read as the one he wore when he was deciding something he had mostly already decided, but was being careful about. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I'll need access to the district files." "You'll have it." She returned to her book. He returned to his. The lamp made the room amber and close, and the rain on the roof continued its sustained note, and Brutus moved from the far chair to the chair nearest the lamp and arranged himself with the authority of an animal who understood the correct hierarchy of warmth. It was some time later she had lost track again, which she was noticing happened here with a consistency she had given up resisting, that the rain changed. It did not slow, but it shifted, the way a sustained note shifts when the musician changes something subtle about how they are playing it, and the shift made the room feel closer. She was reading about bridge maintenance standards. She noted that her arm was on the armrest of the window seat, elbow down, the same arm that had been there for the past hour. She did not register immediately the weight. Then she registered it. His hand was on her arm. Not deliberately, not with the self-consciousness of someone who has made a decision. His hand was on the armrest beside hers, and at some point, she could not have said when it had moved, in the absent, habitual way of someone reaching toward warmth without thinking, and was resting, palm down, over her forearm. He had not looked up from his book. He did not know he had done it. She knew this because she knew the difference. She had learned, in the years since she was 14, to know the difference between touch that was conscious and touch that was not, between the touch that carried a question or a statement and the touch that arrived from some baseline of the body's own need for contact, the way a person sleeping shifts toward warmth without waking. It was the second kind. And she went still. She did not pull away. She also did not respond. She sat very still and felt the weight of his hand on her arm, warm, undemanding, entirely unconscious, and she held the stillness the way you hold the stillness when you are not sure what the next moment will be. She was thrown back. Not by him, not by the touch itself, not by anything that was happening in this room in this moment. But the touch arrived in a body that had its own archive, and the archive had things in it from before she had any choice about what was put there, and the stillness was not the stillness of the present moment but a deeper one, older. It passed, it always passed. It passed in a few seconds, which was faster than it used to, which she acknowledged as evidence of something. She looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at his face, angled down toward his book, entirely composed, entirely unaware. She felt something settle in her, not the old familiar anger that she reached for when the archive opened, but something different. The anger had always been reliable, had always been there, waiting to be useful the way a worn tool was waiting in the hand. But what came now was not the anger. It was something more like the sensation of realizing you are standing on solid ground after a long time spent calculating the stability of the surface beneath you. He was not the archive. He was here in this room, not knowing his hand had moved. She did not speak. He turned a page. The rain played its sustained note on the roof. She looked back at her book. She read the paragraph she had already read, and then the next one. Brutus shifted on his chair, rearranging his considerable weight with a sigh that was more theatrical than strictly necessary. And then he looked up from his book, not at the window, not at the room, but down, and she saw the moment he realized where his hand was. She saw it in the slight change in his face, the small inventory of the immediate situation, and then he looked at her. She met his eyes. She did not move, she did not pull away. She held the look with the steady, level attention that was as much a part of her as her own handwriting, and she let him see her holding it, and she let him see that she was not frightened and not angry and not asking him to explain. He was very still. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It's all right," she said. "I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't," she said. "I know." He removed his hand from her arm, not with the jerk of someone caught doing something wrong, but with the careful deliberateness of someone respecting a boundary they had not known they were approaching. He looked at her for a moment longer, checking, the same way she checked, for the tell of something unspoken, and then he returned to his book. The room was very quiet. She breathed. She looked at the window, where the rain continued its conversation with the glass, and she thought about the archive. She thought about what it felt like to have the old material arrive and then, for the first time in she could not count the years, move through without pulling her under. She thought about his face when he realized his hand had moved, the care in how he removed it. The quiet "I'm sorry" that had not been defensive and had not been self-conscious, had simply been the appropriate thing and been said simply. She thought about what it meant that her first feeling, after the archive arrived and passed, was not anger and was not the cold, familiar steadiness that anger produced, but something that she was going to have to think about more carefully before she named it. Not tonight, though. Tonight the rain was very heavy, and the lamp was amber, and Brutus had rearranged himself dramatically on the chair, in a way that suggested he was managing a complex set of competing needs. She picked up her book and found her place, and she read for another 40 minutes while the storm ran its last hour, and he read across the room in the quiet lamplight, and neither of them said anything further, and the something that did not have a name yet sat in the room between them with the patience of a thing that was not in a hurry. When she stood to leave, he stood as well, the automatic courtesy of it, done without thought. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said, then with the characteristic care, "Are you all right?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said, and she meant it, which was the thing she noted on the way out of the library, down the hall, up the stairs, and into her room where the night sat quiet around the window. She was all right. She was more than all right. By some measure she did not yet have the right instrument to take, but she was all right, and that was a beginning. Brutus appeared at the latch while she was getting ready for sleep, and she let him in, and he settled on her feet with the gravity and warmth of something very certain about where it belonged, and she lay in the dark and listened to the rain slowing outside and thought about the specific feeling of standing on ground you did not expect to be solid. She had stopped cataloging exits. She had done it so gradually that she could not point to the day or the moment. But she was aware of it now, in the dark room with the cat on her feet and the rain outside and the amber lamp off down the hall in the study where she could see its glow under the door, and she was aware of it as the kind of absence that is its own kind of presence. The exit map was still in her head. She had not deleted it because you did not delete things that had kept you safe, but she was not consulting it. She was simply here in this room, in this compound, in this November, with the storm running out of energy outside and the lamp on in the study and the cat on her feet. And she was not unguarded, not foolish, not naive about what trust required and how long it took, but present. She was present. That was enough for tonight. She had been building up to it for 6 days. Not the question itself, the question had been there from the beginning, had been there in some form since Tuesday of the first week when she had stood in her apartment and read the 4-line letter and tried to understand what it meant. But the question had been waiting for the right moment, which was the thing that took 6 days, because the right moment required a version of herself that was not performing steadiness but actually had it. She had the steadiness now. She had confirmed this over the course of the 6 days by testing it in small ways, by noticing when she felt something and letting herself feel it without the usual management, by sitting in the courtyard at night after their conversations and checking the internal state of things, by waking in the mornings and taking an honest accounting of where she was rather than where she had prepared herself to be. The accounting was consistent, she was stable, she was ready. On a Tuesday, and she noted the day and found it appropriate, she went downstairs after breakfast, while Claire was in the kitchen and the steward was somewhere in the east wing, and the compound had its mid-morning quiet, and she walked to the study and knocked. "Come in," he said. She went in. He was at the desk with the documents she had compiled over the past week, the Creslow records, the 5-year data, the argument for the Eastern boundary revision. He had been working with them. She could see the careful marks of someone reading with attention, small pencil notations in the margins that she recognized from the maps. He looked up when she came in. She closed the door behind her. She stood in the middle of the study and looked at him, and said it before she could consider it any further. "Tell me what you actually want from me," she said. "Tell me what this is." Her voice did not shake. She had made sure in the 6 days of preparation that it would not shake, because she was not doing this from weakness and she did not want it to look like weakness. He set down his pen. He looked at her in the way he looked at things that required honest engagement, the full attention, the consideration, the refusal to answer before the answer was ready. She held the look. "I want to tell you why I didn't write the explanation in a letter," he said. "The actual reason, not the version I said at breakfast on your first morning." She waited. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the desk, at the Creslow documents, at the pencil in his hand, which he set down on the desktop with a deliberateness that was not dramatic, but suggested something was being set aside to make room. "The letter version I told you," he said, "was true. I didn't know how to write it without it sounding formal or defensive, and I didn't want to apologize in writing." "That's all true," he looked at her, "but it's not the full reason." "Then tell me the full reason," she said. "The full reason," he said, "is that I wanted to meet you." She held very still. "I had read your letters to the district office," he said, 3 of them. "I had read the petition from Creslow. I had read your complaint about the road, which was, as I said, well argued. I had spent 8 months looking at the watershed maps with a problem I could not solve in the terms I was using, and then I read your letters and understood I was using the wrong terms." He paused. "You have a way of thinking about problems that starts from the actual situation rather than the model of the situation. That is rarer than it should be." She said nothing. "I could have sent the explanation through an intermediary," he said. "I could have written it more carefully and sent it. But I wanted," he paused again, choosing the word with the precision he brought to things he wanted to get right. "I wanted to sit across a table from you. I wanted to see how you thought. I wanted to understand what kind of person came from Creslow 3 weeks after a funeral and stood up in a room full of important people and said true things out loud." He met her eyes. "And I thought that was easier to explain in person, that wanting." The room was very quiet. She looked at him, at his face, at the even gray eyes, at the expression that was the most unguarded she had seen on him in 26 days. He was not performing this. He was not delivering a prepared speech. He was saying the thing simply and leaving it where she could see it. She thought about what she had expected. She had prepared in the 6 days for several versions of this conversation. She had prepared for denial, for the polite version of "I'm not sure what you mean" that was actually the answer "I'm not going to be honest about this." She had prepared for something bureaucratic, for a version of this that explained the situation in institutional terms, that referred to her skills and her record and the practical utility of her being here. She had prepared for ambiguity, the kind designed to avoid commitment. She had not prepared for this. for the simplest possible version of the truth. For I wanted to meet you, for it being said in the same even tone he used for everything and meaning exactly what it said. She walked to the chair across from his desk and sat in it. She sat for a moment. She thought about being honest. She had come here to be honest, and the situation required her to receive his honesty with her own. I spent 5 years afraid of you, she said. I know, he said. Not just being cautious, she said. Afraid, building a very detailed picture of who you were and what you intended and what it was going to cost me. The picture was very complete, I was very certain of it. She looked at the desk. I was wrong about almost all of it. Not all of it, he said. I made the mistakes I made. The mistakes you made were the size of a Tuesday, she said. What I built from them was the size of 5 years. She looked at him. That's not your fault. That's the architecture I built to manage something I was afraid of. I'm working on understanding that. He was quiet. He was listening in the way he listened, with the full attention that gave things room. You asked what this is, he said. I can tell you what it isn't. It isn't a debt. You don't owe me anything for the revised decree. You were right and the decree was wrong and fixing it was what should have been done. You don't owe me anything for not telling you for 5 years. That was a failure on my part. You don't owe me anything for the invitation here or the library or the kitchen or the maps. He paused. I brought you here because there was something I should have told you and didn't, and because I wanted to meet you. Both things were true. Neither of them creates an obligation. She looked at him. I know, she said. Do you, he said. It was a genuine question, asked without any edge, only the kind of careful checking in that came from someone who understood that knowing a thing and feeling a thing were different countries. I'm working on it, she said. Something in his expression shifted, not the almost smile, not the focused attention, but something different again, something that was, she thought, a form of relief, as if a tension he had been holding had been given permission to put itself down. I have a second question, she said. All right, he said. The Eastern Boundary Revision, she said. The Creslow documentation I compiled. What happens to it after the panel review? He blinked. It was, she could tell, not the question he had been expecting. She let the corner of her mouth do what it had wanted to do for a moment. The documentation goes into the formal record, he said, recovering. If the panel approves the revision, it becomes part of the official district record for the boundary change, cited and archived. And if they don't approve the revision, then it goes into the file that is used to request another review, with the additional material forming the basis of the follow-up argument. He looked at her with the expression that was now clearly curious. Why? Because if it goes into the formal record, she said, I would like it cited under my name as the compiler, not just as a general district document. He looked at her for a moment. That was always going to be the case, he said. I wrote your name in the source notation on the first page. She had not seen the first page of the compiled document. She had handed it to him and he had taken it, and she had not stood over his shoulder while he worked with it. She looked at the stack of documents on his desk. May I see it, she said. He turned the stack over and slid the first page across the desk to her. She picked it up. At the top in his neat writing it said, Eastern District Watershed Documentation, compiled by Mara Ellis, District Records, Ashford. Below it, Research Basis, Ellis M. Correspondence 1988-1993, Creslow District Logs 1988-1993, Watershed Field Reports. Her name 4 times in the official record. She set the page down. She thought about being 19. She thought about standing at the back of that room with the petition in her coat pocket, and the conviction that if someone would just listen, someone had listened. And the listening had mattered, and for 5 years she had not known, and now she was sitting in the study with her name in the official record 4 times, and the man across the desk from her had put it there before she asked. She looked at him. You were going to tell me, she said. At the right moment, he said. I was waiting for the right moment. She thought about 6 days. She thought about the right moment and how she had spent 6 days finding it, and how he had spent some number of days, she did not know how many, waiting for his. We have both been waiting, she said. Yes, he said. For the same thing, approximately. I believe so, he said. She looked at the document. She looked at him. She thought about everything that had happened in 26 days, the breakfast table and the maps and the lamp in the study and the courtyard in November and the apple cake and the storm and the letter from Ruth and Brutus on her feet every morning with the certainty of something that had made a decision. She thought about the thing in her chest that she had been not naming for days. She thought, I am not going to not name it anymore. I have been here for 26 days, she said. 27, he said. You arrived late in the afternoon. I count the arrival day. She looked at him. You have been counting, she said. Yes, he said, without any particular embarrassment about it. She set the first page of the document back on the desk. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the man across from her, the ordinary, careful, slightly rumpled man with the hole in the collar and the amber study lamp and the notebook where he wrote her name in brackets and the habit of asking before he sat, and she said the honest thing. I don't know what this is yet, she said. But I know it's something. He was quiet for a moment. That's enough, he said. For now, that's enough. She nodded. She stood because she needed to move, because she had been still for a long time and her body required motion when her mind had been doing work. She walked to the window and looked at the courtyard, where the November light was doing its amber, sideways thing that she was beginning to love in this place the way she loved it in Creslow, the same quality, the same way of catching edges rather than faces. I'm going to go back to the library, she said. The bridge study, he said. The widow's bridge specifically, she said. I want to find out why it's called that. There are 3 versions, he said. None of them agree. She looked back at him over her shoulder. Then I'll compile the documentation, she said, and name my sources. He almost smiled. She left the study and walked down the hall and up the stairs and into the library, and she picked up the bridge study from where she had left it on the window seat, and she sat down and found her place, and Brutus was already there, on the cushion beside her, because Brutus was always already there, and the November light came through the window at its careful sideways angle and made the book in her hands look golden. She read about the widow's bridge. She was present. She was present and her hands were steady, and the name she had not been naming sat in her chest with the warmth and weight of something finally acknowledged, not landed yet, not settled but named, which was the first honest step. She was not afraid of honest steps. She had never been afraid of those. The cheese was the problem. She had said this 3 times now, and each time he had either not heard her or chosen not to hear her, which she was beginning to suspect was a strategy rather than an accident. He was standing at the kitchen counter with the board in front of him, and the calm of a man who believed deeply and incorrectly in the arrangement he had made, and she was standing beside him telling him that what he had done to the bread was a failure of judgment on the scale of things she did not have ready comparisons for. It was 20 minutes to midnight. This was how it had started, not the cheese, not the bread, not the argument, but the 2 of them being awake at the same hour in the same place, which was a thing that seemed to happen here now, a natural consequence of a compound that went quiet at 9 and 2 people who were not, regardless of the hour, actually ready to stop thinking. She had come downstairs for water. She had found him in the kitchen for reasons he had not explained, and that she had stopped expecting explanations for, since his presence in the kitchen at odd hours appeared to be its own explanation. He had been looking at the contents of the cold storage with the thoughtful expression of a man considering a problem he had not yet framed correctly. There's bread, she had said from the doorway. There is, he had agreed without turning around. And there's the end of the cheese from Tuesday, she had said. Also, yes. And you are staring into the cold storage with the expression of a man attempting to locate something specific. He had turned then with the mild look. There should be pears, he said. Claire buys them on Wednesdays. She did not buy them this Wednesday, she had said. I was there. She bought apples and something I didn't recognize. Quince, he had said, also good different use. This was how they had ended up at the kitchen counter at 11:40, with a board between them and the cheese argument, which was the kind of argument that develops when 2 people have different convictions about a subject they both take more seriously than the subject strictly requires. The specific issue was which cheese belonged on which bread. She had an opinion. He had the wrong opinion. The hard cheese, she said, goes on the dark bread. The soft cheese goes on the plain bread. This is not a preference. This is the order of things. The soft cheese on the dark bread, he said, is better. The contrast of the bread's flavor and the mild cheese creates. A mistake, she said. You are describing the creation of a mistake. He cut a piece of the hard cheese and put it on the dark bread with the unhurried confidence of a man who had examined the evidence and reached a conclusion he intended to maintain. Try it, he said. I have tried it, she said. Not the way I've made it. She picked up the piece he had made and tried it. It was good. She set it down and looked at him. That was fine, she said. That was better than fine, he said. I said it was fine. You said it the way you say things are fine when they are better than fine, and you are not ready to update your position. She looked at him. He was cutting another piece of bread with the equanimity of someone winning an argument without needing to announce it. You have known me for 31 days, she said. 32, he said. I count the arrival day. You cannot know how I say things in 32 days. I can know several things about how you say things in 32 days, he said. You say fine when something is fine. You say that's fine when something is better than fine and you're being careful. You say that was fine, past tense, slight emphasis on was, when you've just discovered you were wrong about something and you're giving the concession the smallest possible footprint. She stared at him. He put the cheese on the bread with complete composure. That's very annoying, she said. I know, he said. She picked up her piece of bread and ate it in silence for a moment, looking at the window over the sink, which was showing the dark of the November night and their reflection in it. Two people at a counter with a board between them, one taller than the other, both slightly rumpled, the kitchen light making everything warm. She looked at their reflection for a moment. She had not thought of herself as a person who looked like anything in particular. She was practical about her appearance in the way that people who grew up without excess became practical about most things, sufficient, functional, not requiring more attention than it repaid. But she looked at the two of them in the dark window, and there was something in the arrangement, in the proximity, in the way they were turned toward each other, in the casual sideways way of people comfortable in a space together, that she had not seen herself in before. She looked ordinary and content. She was not sure when that had happened. The quince is in the back of the cold storage, she said, 3rd shelf. I know where it is, he said. Then why were you staring into the cold storage when I came down, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I was thinking, he said. About quince. Not specifically about quince. She looked at him from the side. He was looking at the board, cutting something, and his profile in the warm kitchen light was the profile she had been looking at for 32 days, and knew now the same way she knew the ceiling of her room, the specific tilt of his attention when he was working something through, the small adjustment in his jaw when he was choosing words, the place just between his brows where focus gathered. About what then, she said. He set down the knife. He looked at her, and she held the look with the steadiness she had been building all this time, the steadiness that was real now and not performed. Whether you're still planning to go back to Ashford, he said. She was quiet. I haven't been told I should leave, she said. You haven't been told you should stay, he said. That's a gap I've been aware of. She looked at the board, at the bread and cheese, at the careful arrangement he had made, at the knife he had set down, at his hands resting on the counter on either side of it, with the stillness of someone who was holding something very carefully. I have a job in Ashford, she said. I know, he said. And an apartment. Yes. And plants that Mr. Pace is watering, but not with the right frequency. The letter mentioned that, he said, with the small ghost of the almost smile. He said the succulent on the left was concerning him. It's always concerning him, she said. It's a perfectly healthy plant. He overwaters his own plants and expects everyone to follow his system. He sounds like Henry, he said. They would probably get along, she said. She looked at the window again, their reflection, the warm kitchen, the comfortable, ridiculous argument about cheese. I haven't been thinking about Ashford, she said, much. He was still. I think about the plants, she said, and Diane and Mr. Pace and Ruth, but the apartment, the specific fact of going back to it, I have not been thinking about that very much. She looked at him. I notice I am not in a hurry. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she was naming now without hesitation, the same way she had named the thing in her chest in the study, with the directness that was the only honest approach. What she saw on his face was relief, and behind it something that was not the relief but was what the relief was about, a thing he had been careful with, in the way he was careful with things he valued. Callum, she said. She had not used his name before. She had been aware of not using it, not deliberately withholding it, but holding it the way you held something you were not yet sure was yours to use. It arrived now in the way of things that had been waiting, not with drama, just with the ease of a thing arriving at the right moment. He looked at her with the full attention. "I'm going to go back to Ashford eventually," she said. "I have things there that are mine. I'm not someone who leaves everything. That's not who I am." She paused. "But eventually is not the same as immediately, and I think we both know that whatever is happening here is not finished." "No," he said, "it isn't." So she looked at the board. She picked up a piece of the bread with the soft cheese, his arrangement, the one she had called wrong, and she tried it. It was good. She chewed, she swallowed, she considered. "This one is also good," she said. That was a genuine concession, he said, with something that was, this time, actually a smile, small, contained, belonging entirely to the moment. "Don't make it a larger thing than it is," she said. "I'm not," he said. They stood at the counter at midnight and ate bread and cheese, and she told him about the widow's bridge and the 3 versions that didn't agree. And he told her the version he had heard from Henry years ago, which was different from all 3 she had found in the study. And she said that's 4 versions now, all incompatible. And he said the bridge is still standing, which is more than can be said for most things with 4 incompatible origin stories. And she laughed. She heard herself laugh and registered it as something that had become ordinary, the way the breakfast arrangement had become ordinary, and the maps and the library and the courtyard and Brutus on her feet every morning. She was laughing in a kitchen at midnight, and it was ordinary, and she was not in a hurry to be anywhere else. At some point, she stole a piece of the hard cheese off his side of the board. He watched her do it. "That," he said, "is on the wrong bread." "I know," she said. He shook his head slowly, and the small smile was still there, not the almost smile, not the precursor, but the actual thing, the version she had heard about from the part of her that had been quietly paying attention to what his face did. She ate the cheese on the wrong bread. It was very good, and she was not going to say so again. He cut another piece of the dark bread and put the soft cheese on it, and handed it to her without commentary, and she took it, and they stood at the counter and ate in the warm kitchen at 5 past midnight, with Brutus appearing from somewhere, and sitting at their feet with the expression of an animal who has arrived at an important event, and intends to observe it with appropriate gravity. "The bread is better if you don't let it sit," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said, "I made the bread." She stopped. "You made the bread," she said. "Claire's recipe," he said. "The herb bread, I've been making it since." He paused. "I started making it the week before you arrived. I wanted to learn it before you got here." She looked at him. She looked at the bread. She thought about the first morning at the breakfast table, eating the herb bread and thinking about how good it was and refusing to say so. She thought about all the mornings after, and the bread always there on the sideboard, and Claire's name attached to it. "Claire has been letting you use her recipe," she said. "She taught me," he said. "She found it funny that I asked." "She finds a lot of things charming," she said, "about you." "I think she found it charming that I asked specifically because a guest was coming," he said. She drew her own conclusions. "What conclusions?" she said. "The obvious ones," he said. She stood in the kitchen at 12:17 in the morning with the bread in her hand, and looked at a man who had learned to bake herb bread the week before she arrived, and had been making it every morning since, and had let the credit sit with Claire, because that was the kind of care that didn't need an audience. Something settled in her chest. Not landed, she was not rushing the landing, she had learned not to rush the things she valued, but settled, in the way of something finding the position it was going to inhabit when the time was right. "Callum," she said again. "Yes," he said. She leaned in just slightly, across the corner of the board, not far, the distance of a choice rather than a collision. She watched him be very still, the way he was still when he was being careful. She watched him not reach, not press, not move toward her. She closed the distance herself. She kissed him at 12:19 on a Tuesday night, and she noted the day and found it better than it had any right to be, with the bread still warm in her hand and Brutus at their feet, and the kitchen light making everything amber and close, and it was brief and soft and entirely without performance. And when she stepped back, she looked at him, and the smile on his face was the full version, unguarded, belonging to no other moment but this one. "The herb bread," she said. "Yes," he said. "It's the best thing in this compound," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said quietly, "it isn't." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she picked up a piece of the bread from the board and turned toward the door. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went upstairs. Brutus followed her. She lay in her room in the dark with the cat on her feet and the kitchen still warm somewhere below her and the November dark outside the window, and she looked at the ceiling, the water stain, the plaster crack that ran east to west and changed its mind, and she did not catalogue a single thing. She simply stayed. She was exactly where she was, in this room, in this compound, in this November, and the name she had stopped not naming was settled now in the warmth that had been building for 32 days, and it was not afraid, and it was not in a hurry, and it was hers. She was in no hurry at all. She wrote the letter on a Saturday. Not because Saturday was significant, but because that was the day the feeling of wanting to write it had become larger than the feeling of not knowing where to start, which was how she decided most things, not by forcing the moment, but by noticing when the moment was ready and walking into it. She was at the desk in her study. She thought of it as her study now, not because he had said anything to formalize this, but because the adjustment had happened gradually, without announcement, the way the bookshelves had filled gradually, her books interspersed with the ones that had been there when she arrived, until the shelves were a record of both of them rather than one, and she had stopped being able to say exactly where the arrangement had begun. She wrote the letter to Diane. Diane, who worked in the records office in Ashford, who had written her a short practical letter 5 weeks ago with 2 questions and the last line about whether Mara looked worried. Diane, who had been her closest friend for 7 years, who understood Mara the way practical people understood each other, not by talking about things constantly, but by paying attention to the things that were actually said and noting the things that weren't. She wrote, "Dear Diane, I am not worried. This is the accurate answer to the question you asked in your letter, which I have been intending to respond to for several weeks and was not avoiding, only waiting for the answer to be correct. I am, if I am being precise about it, the opposite of worried. I am not sure I have a good word for the opposite. Something is happening here that I did not anticipate when I arrived and would not have predicted if you had asked me 6 weeks ago, and I am still in the process of understanding it, but the understanding is going well. I will come back to Ashford eventually. My plants are, according to Mr. Pace's most recent letter, mostly fine except for the succulent, which he says he has been talking to. I have no comment on the talking. You can tell him I said this. There is a man here, he bakes bread. He has a cat named Brutus who has decided to sleep on my feet, which I understand is a significant endorsement. He asked me to visit because he had something to tell me and could not figure out how to put it in a letter, which I found frustrating at the time and now understand was the right decision. He is a person of considerable care and very little drama, which suits me better than I expected. I will write more when I know more. Give my regards to the records room. Tell them I have been doing very useful work. The eastern boundary revision will go before the panel in January and the documentation is thorough. With affection, Mara." She read the letter back. She thought about adding more. She decided not to. Diane did not require more, and more would not be more honest, only longer. She folded it, addressed it, set it on the corner of the desk. Then she opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "What do I actually know?" She had been keeping this list since her first week. She had added to it and not removed anything from it because she was not in the business of erasing evidence, only of adding to it honestly. The list had started short enough to fit in one column, cautious and provisional. Now it was long. She read through it. She knew that he woke early and ate the same breakfast, and made the bread himself on a recipe he had learned the week before she arrived. She knew that he had a study light that stayed on until past midnight, and that this had been a habit before she arrived, because Claire had mentioned once that it was something he did when there was a lot to think through, and there had been a lot to think through for a long time. She knew that he wrote in his notebook, and in the margins of maps, and in the backs of policy documents, and that the notations were the thinking out loud of someone for whom writing was how reasoning became visible. She knew that he had made mistakes that were real, and had named them without minimizing them. She knew that the mistakes had not come from cruelty. She knew that cruelty would have looked different. She recognized cruelty. She had grown up adjacent to it and she knew its texture, and what had happened 5 years ago was not cruelty. It was a failure of communication between two people who had been in the wrong position at the wrong moment, compounded by 5 years of silence that had hurt her, and that he had not understood how much it had hurt until he found the letters. She knew that he listened. She knew that he listened the way people listened when they were genuinely interested, not waiting for their own turn but actually absorbing what was being said and letting it change their thinking, which was rarer than it should be. She knew that Brutus trusted him, had trusted him for Claire had told her 4 years, which was the age of Brutus, who had appeared at the compound gate one November as a kitten and had been brought inside and had been sleeping on feet ever since. She knew that he was funny in the dry, quiet way that people were funny when humor was a private thing rather than a performance. The way he had said structurally sound, personally satisfying about Henry's bridges, the way he had said I also take the coffee and go on the first morning in the doorway of her room, the way he had told her about the broom cupboard desk without any particular emphasis, just offered it as information and waited to see if she found it funny too, which she had. She knew that the study looked out onto the courtyard, and that if she sat in the window seat of her room she could see the amber light of his lamp in the evenings, and that sometimes she looked at it before she slept, and that looking at it had the quality of something that settled rather than unsettled. She knew that she had kissed him on a Tuesday at 12:19 in the morning in the kitchen over bread and cheese, and that he had been still, and that when she stepped back the smile on his face had been the unguarded version, and that she had gone upstairs with the bread in her hand and felt, for the first time she could specifically remember, entirely and accurately placed. She looked at the list for a while. Then she turned to a new page and wrote at the top, "What do I still need to understand?" This list was shorter. She looked at it. She thought about the things on it, the practical uncertainties of two lives that had developed independently and would need to find their fit, the questions that could only be answered by time and by more of the ordinary mornings and ordinary evenings and less than ordinary midnight kitchens. These were real questions, and she intended to keep them honest, because she was not a person who allowed optimism to do the work that evidence was supposed to do. But they were smaller questions than the ones she had come with. The largest question she had come with, the one she had carried for 5 years, the one about who he was and what he intended and what it was going to cost her, was answered. Not by a single conversation, not by a declaration, but by 32 days of accumulated evidence that she had gathered the way she gathered all evidence, directly, honestly, without projection. The evidence said, this is a person you can trust. She had been building toward believing it. She was there. She closed the notebook. Outside, the November light was doing its morning thing through the window, the sideways, amber quality that caught edges and made everything look more significant than it usually permitted itself to look. The garden was bare and patient in the way of gardens in late November, the stone paths clean and gray, the hedges disciplined, the bench against the far wall empty. She got up, took the letter to Diane from the desk, and went downstairs. The breakfast room was, as always, occupied before she arrived. He had the newspaper. He had the eggs and the herb bread and the coffee. Brutus was on the cushion by the radiator with the settled contentment of an animal who had decided long ago that this was the correct arrangement and had been proved right by events. She went to the sideboard, she filled her plate, she poured her coffee, she sat down. He glanced up from the newspaper. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. She set the letter to Diane on the corner of the table, envelope addressed, ready to go out with the afternoon post. He glanced at it and then away, not reading the address, just noting it the way he noted things, and returned to his newspaper. She ate. She thought about the letter she had written and what it said. She thought about Diane reading it in the records office in Ashford, probably at her desk with the window that faced the street, probably with a cup of tea that she drank at a specific point in the morning and not before because she had a routine and liked it. She thought about Diane reading, "There is a man here," and the expression that would arrive on Diane's face, which she knew very well. She thought about going back to Ashford eventually. She thought about what eventually meant, and what would happen between now and eventually, and what would be different when she went. She thought about Ruth's letter, "She would have been proud of what you've done with these years." She thought about the years. She thought about what she had done with them, the records work which she was good at, the apartment which was functional and hers, The morning routines and the evening routines and the careful life she had built inside the bracing, which she had thought of as her life but which she could see now had been only one part of it. The part that was safe, the part that required nothing unexpected. She was not, she thought, someone who required nothing unexpected. She was someone who had learned to require nothing unexpected, because unexpected things had often been the kinds of unexpected things you needed to prepare for. But that was a different matter from it being her nature. Her nature had always been to walk into rooms and raise her voice and stand up for the things she understood to be right. And the other thing, the bracing, the cataloging, the careful management of exposure, had been a coat she had put on against the weather and kept on so long she had started to think it was her. She was taking it off. She was doing it gradually, because that was how you did things that had been on long enough to become familiar, but she was doing it. "Callum," she said. He looked up from the newspaper. "I would like to see the panel presentation before January," she said. "The one for the Eastern Boundary Revision. I want to review it." "I was going to ask you," he said. "I'm not asking," she said. "I'm saying I want to." He closed the newspaper. He looked at her with the clear gray morning attention. "All right," he said. "And I want my name on the presentation itself," she said. "Not just in the documentation, in the cover section where the contributors are listed." "That was already the plan," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm saying it out loud so we both know it's confirmed." He nodded. She ate a bite of the herb bread. She thought about the bread, about the week before she arrived, about the recipe and Claire and the mornings. "You should teach me to make it," she said. He looked at the bread. "The herb bread," she said. "You said Claire taught you, teach me." "Now," he said. "Not now," she said, "but before I go back to Ashford." She looked at him. "I want to be able to make it there." He looked at her for a moment. There was the expression she knew now, the one that was the country the smile came from, and then something under it that she was learning to read, the thing behind the almost smile that was more private than anything else on his face, the thing that she thought of as his version of the warm stone in the chest. "All right," he said. She nodded. She finished her breakfast. She put her letter to Diane in the post box by the front door, where the afternoon courier would collect it. She went upstairs to the library and sat in the window seat, and picked up the bridge study and found her place. The Widow's Bridge, 4 versions, all incompatible. She had decided she was going to keep all 4, not reconcile them, not declare one correct, keep all 4 because the bridge was still standing, and all 4 versions of how it came to be called what it was called were true to someone who loved the bridge for different reasons. The bridge did not need a single authorized version. It was a bridge, it held. Brutus appeared at some point through the latch, through the air, through the sheer force of intention, and settled beside her with the certainty of something that had made a permanent decision. She scratched his ears. He closed his eyes and pressed into her hand with the force of a much larger feeling. Down the hall she heard a door open. She did not catalogue the sound. She simply heard it, the familiar sound of the study door, of footsteps on the old stone floor, of someone moving through the compound on whatever the morning held, and she let it be what it was. A sound in a hallway. A morning in November. A woman in a window seat with a book about bridges and a cat that had decided. She had come here expecting punishment. She had come here carrying 5 years of bracing and an exit map and a very complete picture of a person she had never properly seen. She had come here 19 days after a letter with 4 lines and a familiar signature that she had spent years preparing to dread. What she had found was a breakfast table and a set of maps and a kitchen at midnight, and a man who asked before he sat and who listened, and who made the bread and who had been eating alone for 4 years, and was, to use the word he had used, tired of it. She had found herself in this place more than she had expected to find. She had found that the bracing had taken the shape of her without being her shape. She had found that the vigilance had been useful, and was also, in the way of all protective things, something that could be set down when the conditions warranted. She was setting it down, gradually, with the care that things requiring care deserved. She was setting it down, and beneath it she was finding the person she had been before she learned to carry it, curious, direct, practical, capable of standing up in a room full of important people and saying true things out loud, capable of sitting in a kitchen at midnight and closing the distance herself, capable of writing "There is a man here" in a letter to her friend and meaning it entirely. She was finding herself present, not safely distant, not managed, not behind the glass of her own careful observation. Present. She opened to a fresh page in her notebook. She wrote at the top what I actually know. Below it she wrote the single sentence, more than I came with. She underlined it once. Brutus shifted against her hip, resettled, and returned to his particular form of authoritative comfort. The November light came through the window at its sideways, amber angle, and sat warm on her hands and her book, and the notebook page and the 4 words she had written, and the compound was quiet around her with the quiet of a place that had been lived in long enough to know the difference between empty and at rest. She was not empty. She was not going anywhere. Not yet, not until she had learned the bread.